I don't want Ukraine to be partitioned. I don't think it's fair. I mean, I'm an American. I support the underdog. Like, I like the 16 seed for March Madness. That's who I root for, right? And the Ukrainians, this little country that didn't have much of a military, and the Russians just invaded them, try to take out their leader. So I don't want them to have to lose their country, but it's going to happen. I mean, at the very least, I don't see the territory that Russia's occupying now. I see no way that they're going to be able to get it back. Now, no one's going to force them to accept that publicly, but the reality is they're having a harder time fighting. When they started the war, the average Ukrainian recruit was 26 years old. Today, it's mid 40s.
Whoa.
I don't think they're going to be able to keep fighting for another couple years this way. If the Russians, assuming the Russians keep piling and piling and piling, people at them. Russia has a much bigger economy. They have a much bigger population. And the Ukrainians are going to get more desperate. They already see that they're not getting the additional support from the US. They're running out of ammo. They're running out of missiles. They still have air defense, which is really important. But so at a minimum, they're stuck with 18% of their territory that the Russians are occupying. And potentially, it could get a lot worse than that. Potentially, because the Russians have not said we're prepared to sit there. They're still able to attack Russian ships in the Black Sea. Russians can say, we're moving to Odessa. We're taking that. We're securing the Black Sea for ourselves. We're going to take more pot shots at the Ukrainian leadership until Zelensky's gone. And Zelensky might well go if he's not able to keep fighting. You already see the fraying of the Ukrainian political system, opposition to Zelensky from the mayor of Kiev, from the head of the armed forces, because things aren't going so well. So, I mean, the risk is that. The risk is that this war that the United States has taken the lead and has consolidated all of its allies to provide support for Ukraine. And Biden said, we will be there as long as it takes. And within months, he changes that to, well, we're going to do as much as we can. That is a very different message for Zelensky. It's also a very different message for the Europeans, the frontline Europeans, who are going to have to deal with Russian disinformation and infrastructure attacks and cyber attacks and have all of these troops that are right there on their border. So this is a very dangerous thing. I don't think it's not World War III. It doesn't lead to Russia attacking NATO, but it could lead to NATO starting to fragment, becoming much weaker, especially if Trump becomes president. But even if he doesn't, if Biden is no longer able to provide leadership that the Europeans can rely on to ensure that Ukraine can defend itself, they're going to start falling apart on this stuff. So that's the Russia-Ukraine side. The Middle East side, it's kind of a different story, because here Israel, is the more powerful country. Palestine's not a country, but Israel's the more powerful player. They're by far the most powerful military player in the region, both offensively and defensively. Not to mention their 100 nukes that they've never formally admitted to, but they have. And so the question here is, to what extent is this war going to expand? Because a lot of people are getting angry, because there's an axis of resistance that the Houthis are leading, and they're continuing to take shots, including just a couple hours ago against a British vessel this time around. And so you can't actually have shipping through the Red Sea, and the Americans are now hitting them in Yemen. And that's expanding as a separate kind of auxiliary war. And then you have the Iranians providing military support to militants in Syria and Iraq who are hitting American bases. And so far, there haven't been any American servicemen or women killed. But if they do, that's a red line. And the Americans will hit back very hard, and maybe Iran. And the Israelis are more likely to get involved in a war with the Iranians. They just engaged in strikes that killed 5 Iranian members of the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps in Syria. And the Iranians said, that's unacceptable. We're going to hit you back. So, Netanyahu knows if he leaves office, he's going to jail. So he'll do a lot to keep the war going. And the Americans are trying to get him out. So, I mean, there's just lots of ways that this can get worse, not to mention the fact that we're radicalizing millions and millions of Muslims around the world on the basis of all of this violence that is happening. So, I mean, this is a tough one. And by the way, just so we don't only have a negative conversation, I mean, the report is about top risks. So, of course, the bias is to focus on the risks. But there are ways that both of these wars could be resolved more sustainably. On Ukraine, if the Americans and Europeans take the assets that have been frozen of Russia and seize them and use them to rebuild Ukraine, helping Ukraine get into the European Union, which all 27 members approved, and the Americans and Europeans provide some hard security guarantees for the remaining 82% of the territory that Russia has, before, let's say, the 75th NATO anniversary happening in Washington in July, then nothing is going to make Ukraine whole. They won't get their land back, but the Ukrainians in that rump state will have a better future than they would have ever had before Russia invaded. Again, it doesn't make up for the war crimes and the Ukrainians dead and displaced. Nothing will ever do that, but Ukraine will have a future. That will be a win, ultimately, long-term for Ukraine. And with Israel and Hamas, I mean, the Saudis still want to normalize relations with Israel. Israel is in a very strong geopolitical position. If you can get rid of Netanyahu, who opposes a two-state solution, and you can degrade Hamas, and Israel will have a buffer zone with security inside Gaza, small, but they'll focus far more on defense than Netanyahu ever did. And they promise the Palestinians have the ability to get a state, even if they don't have an army. So the security will be provided by a multinational force funded probably by the Gulf states, but they'll get a state. They'll be able to govern politically West Bank and Gaza. And in return, the Saudis normalize their relations with Israel. And Israel becomes stronger and wealthier, and there is more peace across the region. Now, I don't, unfortunately, Tom, I don't think either of those are the baseline scenarios. And the timing, the window for those things to happen is narrow, right? Because the more the violence happens, the more the likelihood is that it spirals out of control. But both are possible. And even better, people involved in these conflicts at the highest levels know that these things are possible and are working to try to make them happen. So all is not doom, even when we talk about these two major wars that are causing so much hardship and sorrow
What do you think
the
the
Middle
odds
East and
are?
Europe.
What do you think the odds are that the Israel-Hamas conflict spills outside of Gaza?
Oh, I mean, it's already happening, so that's 100%. Give me a narrower question that I can answer.
So do you think that the US is going to attack Yemen over the Houthis?
They've already done that. The Americans are now attacking Yemen directly, but they're not yet attacking the leadership by the time this comes out. So today is what? We're taping this on the 26th. So they may well start attacking the leadership by the time it comes out. That is on. The deterrence is not working, so it is escalating. Um, the real question, I think, is what's the likelihood that the Americans and Iran start getting involved in a direct shooting war of some sort? Will there be American attacks on Iran? And also, will American servicemen and women get killed on the back of attacks that Iran is supporting? Those are the big tripwires. That's what gets you $150 oil, global recession. Trump becomes president no matter what in that environment, right? What's the likelihood of that? Let's put it this way. It's not 50%. It's not 5%. If I were handicapping it, I'd probably say right now 20. But it's gone up in the last 2 months because we've taken these incremental steps in the region that have brought us closer to that kind of conflict. That's I guess the best way I can say.
How do you see this playing out? So, young people the world over seem very much to be on the Palestinian side, very much an aggressor victor mentality. They're going to take the side of the oppressed people as they perceive it, no matter what, right, wrong, indifferent, doesn't matter. You've got a bully in the, I'm obviously generalizing, but you have that narrative playing out, and it's really captured the imagination of a lot of people around the world. Um, do you see that playing out where every day young people are gaining more power? Every day the governments are having um, to offer concessions to them. How does that play out in the U.S.? Because I have to imagine if the U.S.'s support of Israel faltered, that would have huge consequences in terms of how that plays out in the region. Do you think that read is right? Do you think anything like that could actually happen?
Uh, it is inconceivable to me that Biden would materially reduce support for Israel. U.S. supports about 12% of Israel's defense spend in peacetime. So it's important, but it's not existential. Biden is a pro-Zionist and has been for decades. So, I mean, he's personally very committed to the state of Israel, though he can't stand Netanyahu. That's a different story. There is a lot of reason for the U.S. to have that relationship that has nothing to do with this war. Intelligence sharing, for example, that's very important, and engaging in mutual efforts against would-be terrorist organizations, rogues, and the rest. I mean, that is Israel is not an unuseful ally to the United States. It's not all take. But you are right that the young people in the United States are much more strongly supporting the Palestinian cause, and that the Democrats are more inclined to support the Palestinians, not Hamas, but the Palestinians, than they are to support Israel. And that is new. And Biden is losing support, especially among Arab Americans, voters in states like Ohio and Michigan and Pennsylvania. And that really matters because in some of those states, the support he has lost is greater than the margin of victory he had in 2020, just from that constituency. So he knows this is a problem for him. So he wants the war to be over soon. Over. He at least wants it to move to a much lower intensity of day-to-day fighting. He's not calling for a ceasefire, but he is calling for a shift in operations. And he also doesn't believe that the Israeli government has a strategic goal in mind when they say destroy Hamas. They're trying to figure out, well, to what end? Like, what does it mean to destroy Hamas? And the Americans dealt with this after 9/11. It's a war on terror. What does it mean to win against terror, right? I mean, it's very hard to destroy an idea. And Hamas is as much a movement, a political movement, as it is a terrorist organization. And it's really hard to destroy. You can kill the leaders, though they haven't yet. But it's really hard to destroy Hamas and not have something come up that is just as problematic with even more supporters a year later or 3 years later. Now, I look, I also understand that part of the reason that there's so much opposition to Israel is because there are just a lot more Muslims than Jews in the world. I mean, you've got well over 1 billion Muslims, and you've got what is it, 20 million Jews or whatever. I mean, it's just not, it ain't close. And I mean, you look at the algorithms in TikTok and you see what the young people are digesting on social media, and it's overwhelmingly pro-Palestine. It's overwhelmingly anti-Jewish, and anti-Semitism is a thing. And it was growing significantly even before all of this. And
Yeah, I saw you put out
after
a report before
before.
October 7th that I was like, what? It had not made my radar. Why do you think it was going up before their response to the attacks?
I think social media was a big component of it. I think
Why would
that the
social media, though, push an anti-Semitic stance?
traffic in white nationalism, traffic in anti-Semitism, making it so much easier. You're not going to a physical meeting. You're digesting this information yourself. A lot of people don't want to do this sort of stuff publicly. You're making it so much easier for people to blame the Jews for stuff. People that might have some of those thoughts occasionally internally that they don't share, and suddenly they have a Reddit board that they can connect on. Suddenly they have memes that they can post and listen to. They have people they can follow. I do think that matters a lot. So, I mean, clearly, I think that's a big piece of it. And I mean, you look at, that crazy person behind the Tree of Life massacre and what he was digesting. You look at, whenever you see the manifestos that are being put together by so many of these people that are engaging in mass shootings, and you find that their minds have been filled with this incredibly horrible disinformation, great replacement theory, and all of this stuff. And okay, it's not all social media. Well, I guess Tucker Carlson's on social media now, but before that, he was on Fox. He was part of it too. There were a lot of people that were trafficking in incredibly anti-human and truly dangerous information, and motivating angry young people to become far more toxic. I think that's what we're looking at.
Okay, so then I have a really simplistic take, but I think this is bulletproof on not how you get to stopping the current conflict between Israel and Hamas, but what the solution must be. I think by its nature, the following statement is true. The only way you're ever going to end that conflict is to create a situation where Palestinians have so much economic opportunity that they believe their children's future will be brighter than theirs. And I have a feeling, I have a belief, a base assumption that the way the human mind works, when you believe that to be true about your kids, all of a sudden your focus just goes to that. I'm going to help make sure that my kid's life is better. Now, when you believe that the only way to do that, because you don't have economic opportunity, is to kill the person that's holding you down, then all of a sudden the ideology of the religions and all that stuff comes into play, and you use that as a galvanizing force. But it actually isn't, thinking through this in real time, bear with me, everybody, that actually isn't the cause. That is the thing that you use to the story that you use to bring everybody together to galvanize on. But what's actually going on under the hood is that you don't believe your children have a future, and you need a thing you can do to get you that. And when the right answer is educate my kids, work really hard, give them an opportunity, you do that. When the answer is attack the person you believe to be the oppressor, then you do that. And so I read this book called Silk Roads. I don't know if you've read it. Man, you'd have a way better take on it than me. But it lays out a really fascinating look at history. And it goes to this period, I forget what years, but I think before 1000 AD, where Jews and Muslims got along just fine. And the way the author explained it, and forgive me, I'm forgetting his name, but the way he explained it was when a society is confident in its own identity and secure in its future, it's completely welcoming and tolerant. And it is only when it loses its sense of who they are, what they stand for, and they become insecure about their future, that now all of a sudden you need somebody to hate. Man, I really feel like that's right. Now, I get it that is so simplistic from a this is all we have to do. Doing it will be brutally difficult. But my thing is, if you put a plan on the table that does not involve economic opportunity, that allows people to really feel like, oh my God, if I really work, my kid's life will be amazing. If you don't do that, you will never solve this problem.
Yeah, I think that there were a lot of people that believed that the Middle East was getting resolved because Israel had peace and broke through with the UAE and Bahrain and Morocco, the Abraham Accords, and then the Chinese facilitated Iran and Saudi Arabia opening and normalizing. And then the fight that happened between Qatar and the UAE and the Saudis, the Gulf Cooperation Council splitting up, that got fixed. So, I mean, people were feeling, hey, the Middle East is like, we're seeing momentum, we've got peace. And of course, the problem was that those millions of Palestinians were feeling like everyone had forgotten about them. They had no future, no opportunity, hunger in Gaza, no proper education, no ability to travel, no ability to have a proper employment, certainly no opportunity for the kids. And in the West Bank, the Palestinians losing more and more and more territory illegally settled, by the Israelis. And so, we may have stopped talking about the Palestinians, but the Palestinians didn't stop hurting. In fact, they were getting angrier and angrier and angrier. And that does not in any way justify anything that has happened in terms of Hamas. I mean, that the acts of October 7th were heinous, and Hamas is a terrorist organization, and I agree they should be destroyed. But it's not surprising that lots of Palestinians will turn to violence when they have no opportunities afforded to them and their children. So the future requires that the Palestinians have a place that not only they can govern, but that they can make lives for themselves. And that means the West is going to have to invest. And most importantly, the Gulf states, who are super rich, are going to have to invest, but the politics have to be made feasible for that investment to take place. And the Israelis have to have security that allows that investment to take place. So there are a lot of moving pieces, and there's a lot more incentive now for the Americans and the Gulf states, and even a lot of Israelis, to take that seriously in a way that everyone hadn't bothered. I mean, the Saudis were about to normalize with Israel before October 7th, and they didn't demand a two-state solution. They just wanted some window dressing. Let's just give the Palestinians some money, because the view was, hey, it's not urgent. So as long as we show our people that we care about the Palestinians, we don't have to fix anything. They're not saying that now. Now they're saying, no, we've actually got to do some serious work so that this doesn't happen again. Like the Saudis are saying never again, right? And that's important. So if you get everyone in the region saying never again, and they put their money where their mouths are, and they're willing to expend some political capital, then you have a solution. But let's also keep in mind that the Israelis have themselves been super radicalized by October 7th. A lot of those young people that were tortured and raped and killed were the most progressive. They were in a dance rave. These aren't the settler populations. These are the people that most wanted peace with the Palestinians. And now you killed them, and you killed their kids. And so they are super angry, and they are very strongly in favor of more military action against the radicals. And if a bunch of civilians get caught up in it, well, that's the fault of Hamas too. And the Palestinians, I mean, when you've done what you've done to them over the last 4 months, right? I mean, we're talking about tens of thousands that have been killed. We're talking about, over 1 million that have been displaced. I mean, you've leveled big pieces of Gaza, completely unlivable. It's going to take a long time to get over that. It's not just about investing in Gaza. It's also about finding a way to build trust and connect bridges that have been completely blown up. So that's why I'm saying I think there is a path, but I don't pretend to be optimistic about that path.
Yeah. That makes two of
Ukraine
us.
too. The Ukraine situation is very similar. Like, even if you give them a state that works and it's reconstructed, they're still going to hate the Russians for a very long time. And I mean, like, hate in a genocidal kind of way, hate the way the Armenians hated the Turks after the genocide, right? And that's when you radicalize that many people, that's a dangerous environment. Like, what's the likelihood that in 5 years' time, there's going to be an IRA type Ukrainian paramilitary organization that's just trying to blow up Russians? I think it's fairly high that that's going to happen, given what's just occurred over the last 2 years.
Yeah. So then I share that concern. I try to be optimistic. I think things rarely work out as poorly as you fear they might. And so I will pose a question knowing that somehow, some way, I believe that we're going to avoid it. But I'd love to hear a thoughtful take. What are the potential guardrails that if you get Israel just will not back down, Ukraine, let's say Trump comes into power, it gets divided, NATO begins to back off because they realize the US is no longer going to be the big dog there. The Houthis keep going, and so we end up bombing directly Yemen. We get into an open conflict with Iran. China sees their opportunity to, if I don't know if he got elected or not, but I know that there was a pro-independence person running for election in Taiwan. Like there are so many things on the table right now that speak to instability. What are the guardrails that stop us from ending up in World War III?
Well, I mean, first of all, one guardrail is that the Russians are very uninterested in getting into a fight with a NATO country directly. And that's how you get real conflict between nuclear armed powers. When, for example, when there was a rocket that went just across the Ukrainian border into Poland and killed two Polish villagers, I think they were farmers. It turned out that it was a Ukrainian air defense missile that misfired. But the Russians did everything they could immediately to show photographs and whatnot to say, hey, this wasn't us. This wasn't us. Where you can imagine the Russians who are angry that the Poles are facilitating all these weapons to be sent to Ukraine to use against Russians, might have said nothing, or might have even, said, well, so what? I mean, this is what happens if you're going to send all these missiles and kill our citizens, then, you're basically a belligerent in the war. They didn't do that. They've been very careful not to get involved in a direct war against NATO. So, I mean, the lessons should be learned is Ukraine not in NATO. That's why they're vulnerable to the Russians killing them. It's why Finland and Sweden wanted to join NATO. Is because they understand that actually means something, that after 2014, when the Russians came into Crimea, maybe the West should have responded more seriously than they did, So that's a guardrail. A second guardrail, the two most powerful countries in the world, US and China, really don't want a crisis. They just don't. They're trying very hard to keep any conflict limited from escalation. That's why you're seeing all the military to military engagement that has recently started up again. That's why since mid-October, the Chinese decided to stop with all of their near-miss overflight next to American aircraft that were doing exercises and freedom of navigation patrols off of the Chinese border in international airspace, avoiding the potential for direct conflict. Part of that is because the U.S. knows that they're dealing with two wars and they don't need any more fighting. Part of it is because China has economic problems and it is trying to ensure that not everyone leaves China in terms of investment. And geopolitically in Asia, they're driving a bunch of countries towards the United States on security: India, Indonesia, Japan, South Korea. I mean, all of these things. So I think that's a guardrail. But those guardrails do not prevent these wars from getting worse. They prevent World War III, but they don't prevent the wars from getting worse. So the U.S. conflict, U.S. versus itself in 2024, there's nothing preventing U.S. institutions from continuing to deteriorate. There's nothing stopping U.S. democracy from experiencing a much worse crisis. We don't have guardrails against that. Unfortunately, we should. We don't. There are no guardrails that are preventing Zelensky from losing power, for more of Ukraine being taken over by Russia. There are no guardrails right now that are preventing the war between Israel and Hamas from spilling over more broadly into the Middle East. So as much as I think the likelihood of global war is thankfully actually very low, the likelihood that these serious conflicts are going to continue to intensify is actually very high.
Yeah, that's very nerve-wracking. And I am reminded why you call this the Voldemort of years. So let me ask, if Trump gets elected, is that an existential threat to democracy?
I think that if Trump is elected, there will be a permanent amount of damage done to the U.S. political system that will be very hard to come back from. I do not believe the U.S. will become a dictatorship. I certainly don't believe we'll see civil war, but I think the US political system will look more like something between Poland and Hungary. And what I mean by that is that rule of law will take a structural hit. The party in power will end up with structural advantages that will make it very hard for the opposition to come back.
If you're tired of trying to find the real truth, you have to strive to tell whether the news that you're getting is actual real reporting, biased narratives, trolling, selective reporting, whatever the case may be, then you need to be using ground news. Ground News compiles stories from across the global political spectrum, giving you every angle so that you can get the full picture and aren't being blindsided. I especially like their election page, where you can learn more about candidates, sort news coverage by key voting issues, and get a specific election-related blind spot feed to make sure you're not missing out on important stories. Go to ground.news/Tom or use the link in the video description to subscribe today. If you sign up through my link, you'll get 40% off the same Vantage plan I use to get unlimited access to all their features. I really like Ground News. I think you guys are going to love it. They are doing important work, and I hope you're going to check them out and stay informed and get rid of your blind spots. And this is a great way to do it with Ground News.
It will make it very hard to have free and fair elections that can be contested effectively. So right now, we can have a free and fair election, but the majority of American people have questions. And a significant minority of the American people think it's fake, the people that lose. But we can still have them. I think if Trump wins, there is a reasonable chance that it will be materially harder to have a free and fair election in the United States. I think that's a big problem.
Do you think that the government is being weaponized against Trump right now?
I think that there are some decisions that have been made that are politically unjust against Trump. I think that that does not describe a strategic effort of the Biden administration across the board. But for example, I believe that the felony case in New York on financial charges brought against Trump is an illegitimate case. And I've had that conversation with high-level Democratic attorneys who agree. A politicized case that would be a misdemeanor if it was a regular U.S. citizen, but because it's Trump, it has been raised to a felony. I think that is unjust. I think that is a weaponization of the U.S. judicial system against the former president. I think the Washington and Georgia cases are completely just and have merit. I think that there has been a level of disinformation against Trump from some political figures on the Democratic Party that run with headlines without doing research and then end up looking stupid as a consequence. And I think that, unfortunately, like if you've got 91 indictments and most of the cases legitimate, but one of them really isn't, that really hurts your ability to make the argument on the other cases. Like you said before, if you're caught in a lie once in this environment, people are going to mistrust you on all of those other cases, even though your reputation has been sterling in those other cases, right? I think that the Colorado decision, Supreme Court decision to try to throw Trump off the ballot, and Maine as well, I think was illegitimate. I mean, it'll be overturned in the Supreme Court, in my view. But I mean, Trump, whether or not you consider Trump an insurrectionist, he was impeached for insurrection. He was not convicted. That was overturned. And there are none of the indictments that he is presently facing are charging him for insurrection. So I don't understand what taking him off the ballot. For me, that was politicized by the Colorado Supreme Court. And if I were a Trump supporter, that would seem unfair to me. That would seem like a witch hunt to me. That would motivate me to fight against these guys, right? But I also believe that Trump did everything he could to actually overturn a free and fair election. Did everything he could, and he failed. But if he could have succeeded, he would have succeeded. And I cannot, I mean, the fact, everything I just told you does not compare. These are not, apples and apples we're talking about. I mean, you've got a guy, the former president, that tried to overturn a free and fair election. That's foundational to American democracy. And in any well-functioning democracy, if that guy is trying to run for president and looks like he's going to win, that should be the number one issue you're discussing, right? Because that's a bigger deal than anything else. Bigger deal than the economy. It's a bigger deal than the border. It's a bigger deal than abortion. It is literally the biggest deal in a well-functioning democracy. There's only one problem, and that is that the United States is not a well-functioning democracy. So it is not the biggest deal because people don't think it's the biggest deal. That's a problem. They don't value the facts or the democracy the way they need to.
One of the things that I feel like is really falling apart, and this is the thing, I don't have a good solution for this, is shared narratives. So Yuval Noah Harari talked about this very eloquently, and he said, look, there are other species that can coordinate in massive groups, as big, if not bigger, than the way that humans can do. But we're the only ones that can coordinate in these huge groups flexibly. And he said the way that we create that flexibility is through shared narratives. Now, they have historically come most compellingly through religion. And as religion changes, I resonate with the language that, God is dead, Nietzsche's sort of interpretation of that can hackle some people. So I'll just say that the tenor of it is changing, that in a world where I think a lot of people have alternate belief systems or things that they gravitate towards, or not even necessarily thinking about religion, I think there's a God-shaped hole in all of us. And I am not a believer, as my longtime listeners will know, but I acknowledge that I have a God-shaped hole in me that I need to fill with meaning and purpose. And as we fragment, so going back to this idea, as we fragment, this gets very scary because we don't have shared narratives anymore. And so now we're not necessarily cooperating in as large groups, where at least before we would have the narrative of the nation. And so we had something that we could galvanize around. But obviously with the rise of populism cyclically throughout history, it's not like just now. But whenever that rears its ugly head, then some very dark things can happen. But on the flip side of and so I'll say that's like a hyper shared narrative, right? An injustice has been done to me and the other person did it and we need to rise up against. Okay, cool. Shared narrative can get dark, but you can also have on the other side where there is no shared narrative, you are now, to your point about you're being pulled in a direction that doesn't unite us, but only fragments us further. And I'll plug into that. The reason that I don't look at that and go, oh, we just need to then come up with a shared narrative. In fact, I'm going to put this in the framing of your book. You open your book, The Power of Crisis, with the story of Reagan and Gorbachev. And Reagan says to Gorbachev, hey, if the US, this is like at the height of the Cold War, if the US were invaded by an alien, would you help us? And Gorbachev said, yes, absolutely. And that idea of, okay, there are things that we could rally around that take us out of our smaller narrative into a larger narrative, hence the title of the book, The Power of Crisis. There is a thing that can bring us together and give us that shared narrative. But what scares me is if you plug in AI bias into this equation,
you can't get
now
there.
Now I'm like, whoa, like one, who gets to decide what the AI's value system is, what the AI's belief system is, how the AI interprets truth, what the AI reinforces? And then if there are a lot of AI, which is probably the thing that protects us from an authoritarian answer, but at the same time, then you have all this competing reinforcement that again just brings us back to fragmentation. So as you look at that suite of unnerving potential problems, what do you see as our path to the other side of this, to doing it well?
Yeah. So President Biden just 2 weeks ago, had a group of 7 AI founders / CEOs, the most powerful companies in this space as of right now. That will not be true in a year or two. There'll be vastly more. Some of them are hyperscalers. Some of them are large language model creators, and some are both. And it was very interesting because those 7 companies basically agreed on a set of voluntary principles that included things like watermarks on AI, and reporting on vulnerabilities, sharing best practices on testing the models, all of this stuff. And the stuff that if you looked at it carefully, you'd say, those are all things we want. Those are things that will help protect us from the worst excesses of AI proliferation. Now, on the one hand, they are not only were they voluntary, but they were super undefined in ways that every company that was there could already say, we're doing all of those things. We don't need to spend any more money on them. But I am told those 7 companies are planning on creating an institution that will meet together and will work on advancing those standards and defining them more clearly. We'll see where that goes. But also, I mean, as more companies get in the space, you're creating an expectation in the media, in the government, in the population, that these are things that they're committing to. And so increasingly other companies will also want to show that they're doing that. And maybe there will be some backlash if they're not effective at doing so. But what was interesting to me about that initial meeting is the White House convened it, but they didn't actually set the agenda really at all because they don't have the expertise. They don't have the technology. They don't know what these tools do. I mean, they're trying to get up to speed and hire people as fast as they can, but they're not going to be anywhere close to these companies. And what I think needs to happen in short order is that you're going to need to create an approach that marries these things. You'll need the tech companies to have these institutions that they are involved in standing up, but the governments are going to need to work with them. And they're going to need to have carrots and sticks. There'll need to be licensing regimes like we see for financial institutions. There's going to need to be deterrence, penalties. They need to be responsible for what's on their platforms. And if they're used in nefarious ways, there's going to have to be penalties that could include shutting them down. There's also some carrots that they should have as this becomes a field of thousands and thousands of companies. There's proprietary data sets that the US government and American universities have access to that you can drive massive wealth with AI. And maybe those will become public data sets that any AI company that's licensed can potentially use. I mean, all of this needs to be created, but we are nowhere on this right now. And the AI that we've been hearing about for 40 years, but suddenly it's exponential. And exponential is not like Moore's law exponential. It's not like a doubling every 18 months. It's like 10x in terms of the size and the impact of the data sets every year. So we don't have years on this. And that's why the urgency. That's why, I mean, I've completely retooled, our knowledge set to focus on what's the impact of AI on geopolitics. I mean, in the last year, because I've never seen anything that's had so much dramatic impact on how I think about the world and how geopolitics actually plays out. And so far, you and I have only talked about the disinformation piece and a little bit of the job piece. We haven't talked about what's probably the most dangerous piece, which is the proliferation piece of things like hackers and, developing bioweapons and, viruses that can kill. I mean, I'm sure you've heard this. I've heard from friends of mine that are coders that in past weeks that they cannot imagine coding without using the most advanced AI tools right now, because it's just a world changer for them and how much they can do. I don't know any hackers, but I'm sure that criminal malware developers are saying, I can't imagine developing criminal malware or spear phishing without using these new AI tools. Because, I mean, it's just going to allow them to target in such an extraordinary and pinpoint way and also to send out so much more, sort of capable malware that will elicit so much more engagement, and therefore, bring so much more money to them, or shut down so many more servers and give them so much more illicit data, and so much of the illicit data that they've already collected from the hacks on, all of these companies that you've heard about, Target, for example, other firms. I mean, so much of that so far is just, oh, we're just selling that for people that want to like use the credit cards. No, now you're going to sell it to people that are empowered with AI that can generate malware against that data. And that, again, and that's like, we're going to develop all these new vaccines and new pharmaceuticals that'll deal with Alzheimer's and deal with cancers. And it's going to be an incredible time for medicine, but we'll also be able to develop new bioweapons that will kill people. And that's not going to be just in the hands of North Koreans or Russians in a lab. It's going to be in the hands of small number of people that our intelligence agencies are not yet prepared to effectively track. Right. There's a reason why we don't have nuclear weapons everywhere. It's because it's expensive, it's dangerous, it's really hard. I mean, imagine the biohackers thinking back to the days when, oh my God, how hard it was? Like, you'd have to actually mix the stuff in a lab. You could die yourself. I mean, now we can do all this on the computer. The quaint old days, So yeah, I worry deeply about the proliferation of these incredible tools used in dangerous ways. And we are not going to be able to allow the slippage that we have had around cyber tools, that we have had around terrorism and their capabilities. We're going to need to get our filter is going to have to be incredibly robust.
Do you have a sense of how we pull that filter off?
Well, part of it is, as I say, a hybrid organization. So there have been some people that have spoken about an international atomic energy agency model. So it'd be an international AI agency model. I think that won't work, because that implies a state agency with inspectors that have a small number of targets that they're engaging in those inspections on. I don't think that works. I think what you're going to need is an agency that involves the tech companies themselves. And so, if you're developing an AI capacity in your garage, if you want to use that anywhere, it's going to have to be licensed. If you've got software that's going to run AI, it's going to have to be licensed. And the tech companies that are running these models are going to have to police that in conjunction with governments. So I think this is a new governance model. I don't think it will work with the governments by themselves, because they won't have the ability to understand what the capabilities of these algorithms are, how fast they can proliferate, what they can do, how they can be used dangerously. But the governments are the ones that are going to be able to impose penalties. They will have the effective deterrent measure. I mean, Microsoft, Google, Facebook, Meta, these companies are not, what are they going to do? They'll throw you off their platform. No, that can't be the penalty for developing, a bioweapon. You're going to need to be working together around this. And together, not just in the company hands over the information to the government, the agencies are going to need to be much more integrated.
So here's one thing that I've been thinking a lot about. Be very curious to get your feedback on this. So I am definitely somebody who is a big believer in Bitcoin and what's going on in cryptocurrency. But as I look at it, I'm like, ooh, like this is definitely, if we have it, the thing that makes me believe in Bitcoin specifically is that it's the closest thing to a digital recreation of an exploding star. So for people that understand, how gold has become across a bunch of cultures throughout time, the thing is because it doesn't mold, it doesn't rot, and it could only be generated from an exploding star. So there's no way to fake it. There's no way to make more.
I see.
And
Interesting. Yeah, got it.
So you have this thing that's very good about carrying wealth across time and space. It isn't that it is inherently, like people say, oh, but you can make jewelry and stuff. Yeah, but if we don't care about jewelry, then that never becomes a thing, and there's no reason that we should care about gold jewelry.
Yeah, I mean, the industrial uses of gold are utterly marginal to its utility as a currency. I agree.
Exactly. So along comes Bitcoin, which same idea. There is a finite amount of it. You can never make more.
Yep.
It's the sort of computer equivalent of the exploding star. And it's better about going across space. So maybe it's equal to gold in terms of across time, but it's certainly much easier in terms of going across space. So I'm like, okay, cool. I really believe in that. But as you create that, you now have alternatives to government fiat currencies.
Right.
And that is this slight weakening of their power. They're going to obviously push back on that. And so we'll see how that sort of plays out from a regulatory perspective, whether they just get in on it and start buying it, or whether they get very anti-it. I think that yet to be determined. But when I think about the things that will weaken the government's hold on things, the next thing that comes into the picture is just the government's absolute inability to stay on top of AI. And so now you've got, we're already having to lean on these companies. And so if it becomes the most powerful tool, the most dangerous tool, and it's not controllable by governments in the way that nuclear weapons is, that's another weakening of the power. And so now you start getting into this two paths before you. You get Bilyeu's, I don't know if you know who Bilyeu is, but you get his idea of the network state, where it's a non-geographically bound grouping. So going back to that idea of shared narratives. So people share narratives from all over the world. They come together. They have digital currency. They can sort of make their own rules and laws. And then the other one is the authoritarian version, where it's like, we just grab a hold of all of this. It is top down, and you're going to adhere, or life is going to be brutal. Obviously, that would be China's take. But both of those aren't ideal for me as a child of the 80s, where it's just like, oh, this is so stable and wonderful. So one, do you think that are those the sort of two most likely poles, or is there something in the middle that's more likely?
Yeah. So I agree with you that Bitcoin and crypto represent a similar kind of proliferated, decentralized threat to governments as AI. Having said that, crypto, the amount of crypto, in existence, compare and being used compared to fiat currencies is de minimis. And I do not think that there is any plausible threat of scale against fiat currencies in the next, say, 5 years. And I do believe that if it became a threat of scale, every government in the world that matters would do everything they could to ensure that they continue to have a regulatory environment that maintains fiat currency as dominant. And they'll lean into stable coins, they'll lean into the technology, but they will want to have control over it. China, obvious. I mean, you've got WeChat and lots of digital currencies that work, but you have to use the digital RMB. They refuse to have currency that they don't have control over because they want the information set. They want the political stability. In the United States, it's also the importance of having the dominant reserve currency globally, which matters immensely to America's ability to project power, to maintain, our level of indebtedness, all of these things. So to weaponize finance, to declare sanctions and tariffs, to get other countries to do what we want, to align with us. So given that I think the timeline for AI being fundamentally transformative in governance is minimum 2 to 3 years, maximum 5 to 10, I only see one thing here. Even climate change, which is huge and in front of us, and trillions of dollars of impact, and changing the way everybody thinks about spending money and governance and where they live and all of that. Climate change in many ways is slower moving and slower impact than what we're going to see from AI. Like, I think AI is going to have much more geopolitical impact in the next 5 to 10 years than even climate will. And that was, what was one of the things that when I wrote the book, The Power of Crisis, and that was before AI really took off. For me, each of the crises I was talking about were becoming larger and more existential. And I started with the pandemic because I was writing kind of in the middle of it. And then I moved to climate. And then I moved to disruptive technologies and AI. And people were saying, how could you not put climate, as the big one? I'm like, well, because climate, is, first of all, it's not existential. We are actually on a path to responding to climate. It's just going to cause a lot of damage. And we're going to end up at 2.5 degrees, 2.7 degrees warming. And it's also going to happen over the next 75 years. And we'll probably be at peak carbon in the atmosphere at around 2045. And then a majority of the world's energy, starts coming from, or peak carbon energy use, excuse me. And then a majority of the world's energy starts coming from renewable sources. And that's that's an exciting place to be, where with AI, we don't have 50 years for AI. We don't have 30 years for AI. We have 5-10 years to figure out if we're going to be able to regulate this or not. And if it's going to look more techno-utopian, or if we're not here anymore. I mean, honestly, I haven't really said this publicly, but we're having a broad enough discussion. How old are you?
47.
Okay, I'm 53. I think that, knock on wood, I don't think that either of us are likely to die of natural causes. I think at our age, we are probably either going to blow ourselves up, as humans, or we're going to have such extraordinary technological advances that we will be able to dramatically extend lifespans in ways that are, dealing with cell death and molecular destruction and genetic engineering. And just looking at what is ahead of us over the next 10, 20 years, this does not feel remotely sustainable. But that doesn't mean it's horrible. That means it's one of two tail risks. And I just can't tell if it's the great one or the bad one. But to the extent that I have any role on this planet, I'd like to nudge us, as I know you would too, in the better direction. And that means getting a handle on this technology and working to help it work for humanity, with humanity, as opposed to, not against it, but, kind of irrelevant to it. We don't want technology that does not consider human beings as relevant on the planet.
No, I agree with that. The thing that I think that we're going to have to contend with, though, is what is a governmental response going to be to the potential of their weakened power? So
yep, that's right.
We know how China is dealing with it. So it was really amazing to watch China open up the capital markets and really just explode. And in your book, you talk about this. I found it a really interesting insight that forced me to reorient my thinking about what China did. And so, if you've read Mao, The Untold Story, it's it's just devastating to see how much death and destruction came out of an authoritarian government. And then at the same time, you're like, I don't know that America's approach is always the most optimal answer. I forget the exact words you used, to every problem. And what you pointed out with China, when they opened up, just the growth rate was pure insanity. It's really pretty breathtaking. But they learned from the collapse of Russia exactly what not to do, and now they're clamping back down. Now, as somebody that grew up in the US, man, I look at that and I'm just like, dude, that I don't like that. That freaks me out. The thought of always being on that razor's edge of the individual doesn't matter and we can just completely obliterate you. But then I watch not even the government necessarily in the US, but the people in the US giving up on free speech, which, as I think about what's the one thing that you just can't let go of if you want the individual to matter. And I think if you want to get to the quote unquote right answer, you have to have free speech. Even in my own company, where it would be very tempting to run my company in an authoritarian way, I just know I have too many blind spots. So I'm constantly trying to get the team to be hey, say whatever you need, whatever you believe to be true. If what you believe to be true is that I'm an asshole and I do not know what I'm doing, you need to be able to say that. Now, I'm going to push you to articulate why. I don't want some emotional statement. I want give me, going back to truth, right? What is our goal? What's the metric by which we determine whether we're getting towards our goal? What can you show me in the math that shows that I'm doing this the wrong way? And then, what's your take and why do you think it's going to work better? But when I look at just the instability of that on both sides. So you have authoritarian rule where we just obliterate it. As soon as we don't feel like the government's in control, we kidnap, those my words, Jack Ma, re-educate him, and then put him back forward. Terrifying. Or on our side, where it's like, no, if you say something I don't like, you 100% should be canceled, going back to what you said about Trump. So how do we, as two people that want to nudge this in the right direction, what's the right pressure point? Is it the government? Is it the individual? Is it the algorithms? Is it making sure that AI has the right biases? Like what's the right pressure point?
I don't know that the right biases are the issue. I mean, you know, again, there's a lot of whack-a-mole going on, tweaking these models as you roll them out. I think it is more in trying to ensure that you have clarity and transparency in what these models are doing. And then the data that's being collected as it's being collected, that has to be shared. These are experiments that are being run real time on human beings. And we wouldn't do that with a vaccine. Even in an emergency, we would have a lot more testing. We wouldn't do that on a new GMO food because we'd be concerned about, you know, sort of disease, cancer, you name it. But we're doing that with these algorithms. It's very interesting to me and a little chilling that the Chinese, who have done everything they can in the last 20 years to catch up and surpass in some areas to the Americans in new technology areas, they look at AI and large language models and they've said, okay, we're going to have control over these. We're going to have full censorship over these. We're not going to give them data sets that they can run on in the public because they think it's too dangerous. And that means that the LLMs that the Chinese are running right now are crap. They're nowhere near as good as what the Americans presently have. And that's because the Chinese are willing to accept the economic disadvantage to ensure they have the political stability. And I think that the United States, again, we're not going to be able to simply stop this progress. The progress is going to happen. There's too much money. It's too fast. We don't know what we're doing as a government in response. And also there are too many things we're focused on. Yes, you're focused on proliferation, but when what I say is fake news and what I say is disinformation, someone else is saying you're trying to politicize it, right? And then you'll have a whole bunch of people saying we can't slow down our companies because we need to beat the Chinese, who are going to be the largest economy in the world, just like, you know, Zuckerberg did with Facebook, 10 years ago. And for all of those reasons, I don't think you can slow this. I don't think you can stop it. I think what we need is a partnership between the technology companies and the governments. And that is going to have to be regulated at the national level. It's going to have to be regulated at the global level. By the way, the financial marketplace is not so radically different from this. Like, you have algorithms, trading algorithms that run, and they need to be regulated because you want to know that certain types of trading is not allowed and other types of trading is. And, the 2008 financial crisis, when it hit, even though it started in a small part of the economy, we were all worried, oh my God, this could explode the whole economy. What happened? All the banking CEOs and the Fed head, the chairman of the Fed, the Secretary of Treasury, they got together and said, okay, what are we going to do to ensure the system can stay stable and in place? And that happened real time. And one of the reasons it works relatively well in the financial space is because the central bank governors are technocratic and somewhat independent from government. Like, they know that you want to avoid a bad depression, a market collapse. They know that you have monetary and fiscal tools that you can use to respond. We're going to need to create something like that in the technology space. We're going to have to create regulators who are in government but are working directly with the tech companies as partners to avoid contagion, to respond immediately to crises when they occur. And they won't just lead to market collapse. They could lead to national security destruction. They could lead to lots of people getting killed, but it's going to be the same basic kind of model. And we got to start working on that now.
Why are we more likely to be easily divided than Japan or Germany or anybody else?
Yeah, well, I mean, it's kind of the Trump question. See, I don't see Trump as the principal risk. I see him as a symptom. So why is the United States the country that has elected Trump and now might elect him a second time? Why isn't that happening in other advanced industrial democracies? Why do the Americans talk about stop the steal and none of that happened? Even after Brexit in the UK, the domestic political system basically runs the same way. Why is that happening? And there are a lot of things that people talk about. They talk about inequality. They talk about identity politics, but those things exist, demographics changing. Those things exist in a lot of other countries, maybe not to the same degree. The US is more unequal economically today than the rest of the OECD, but not by a massive amount. I think that the bigger issue is that the United States is the country where its social institutions have most eroded. So, I mean, the US is a country that historically has been by far the most religious and God-fearing. And yet in the last 40 years, church membership has fallen off a cliff in the United States. Belief in the church, trust in the church has gone way down, just like belief in Congress. The belief in the public school system has gone way down in the US, just like belief in the judiciary. And I think that the fact that those institutions have really eroded in a country that is much more driven by individualism and entrepreneurship and unfettered capitalism, which has driven incredible growth in the US, and it's why the US is leading the world in AI and other countries are behind. I mean, we're the country with Elon Musk, and he wasn't even born in the US, but he knew that this was the place he could make it. And Jeff Bezos and Bill Gates, we have those people. But we're also the one where so many Americans feel unmoored. They feel like nature got them. They've got genetics, but they don't have nurture anymore. Whether it's the atomized family, or it's the lack of national service, or it's just the civic institutions all falling apart. And now, in the last 10 years, nurture has been replaced by something. It's been replaced by algorithms. And we're the country that has all the influencers. We're the countries where everybody wants to be a personal brand. But we're also the country that has so many of our young people wanting to engage in self-harm and even suicide because they're spending all their time on social media where they're being algorithmically disintermediated from the rest of society and only engaging with people that they already agree with, or things that make them angry, both of which are great for the corporate business model, but are anathema to creating civic adults, to raising a nation that connects with each other. I think if I had to point to one thing that has really eroded American democracy, it would be that. I think that's where the
social
US
media
is most
everywhere.
vulnerable.
Are we just ahead of the curve?
Yes.
Or do you think that there's something unique about either the cultural fabric of America or something else that has governmental policies that have made us more vulnerable than somebody else?
I think it's both. Okay, I mean, you see this happening. I mean, Canada, it's definitely happening too. You saw Ottawa and the truckers' riots and Rebel News, and there's a lot of misinformation in Canada too. And democracy in Canada has eroded somewhat, nowhere near as much as the US. Japan, almost not at all. Sense of community in Japan is so much stronger. It's basically a single-party democracy. There was a very interesting event in Japan that you may have seen. It was a couple of months ago. There was a Japan Airlines aircraft that hit I think it was a Japanese Coast Guard smaller plane that was routed right in front of where this plane was about to land or take off. And the plane caught on fire. 330 plus people, passengers, were on the plane. Every single one of them got off within like 5 minutes. And not only did they follow the instructions of the stewards and stewardesses, like literally immediately, not one of them took a bag off the plane because they were told not to. Now, that is inconceivable to me on a United flight. I mean, is it unpopular for me to say that some of this is cultural? I mean, am I going to get canceled for that? I travel to Japan all the time. I know that is different. I mean, the Americans, we're just a really individual oriented society. And so I do think that some of this is different. Some of this is actually unique to what makes Americans tick. And as a consequence, when the social contract starts eroding, and when the American political and economic system doesn't work as well for a lot of Americans, they feel left behind, they feel forgotten, it's going to hurt American society a lot more, right? Because that safety net, and some of that safety net is cognitive, some of that safety net is emotional, is just not there for people in a way that I think it is in a lot of other countries. I think it is in a more collectivist Germany, for example, than it is in the United States.
Yeah. So if you're going to get canceled for that, let me join you in the cancellation. It is self-evident to me that culture plays a huge part in everything, just life, full stop, period, in general. When we talk about nature versus nurture, that's effectively what we're talking about. The nurture being the culture. It could be the culture of your family, the culture of your city, town, whatever, or the thing nobody is talking nearly enough about, the culture of the class that you were born into and thusly raised in. If I were to, and I admittedly have not thought about this before, so I'll be very interested to get your take on this, but as I was listening to you talk, the thing that jumped to mind as to why Japan, which I am just a literal Japanophile, I could not love them anymore. They are a hyper conservative culture. So I think that speaks a lot about that. They're also a more collectivist culture. You see yourself as integrated into the whole more than somebody that's going to stand out. What I think is happening in America right now, and again, I'm thinking through this in real time, is that we are an individualistic culture that has really done extraordinarily well with capitalism, but the Gini coefficient is real. And as the gap between the poorest among us and the richest among us grows wider, you are going to get people, even though by global standards, lower income people in America are still way better off than lower income people elsewhere. But it doesn't feel like that if you're broke and you are cleaning Jeff Bezos's third mega mansion. And so that reality is what I think we're watching play out now. And you have some people that are crying out for collectivism, and you have other people that are still staunchly individualistic. Now, you've talked about something I've not heard anybody else talk about, which is that one of the big concerns on the global stage for what's happening in America, the division in America and why it's so problematic, is all of a sudden identity politics is steering a lot of the policy and the sort of how you can expect America to behave versus economics. And previously, the rest of the world could just go, America's going to do whatever's in their economic best interest. Easy enough to predict. Cool. I know the script and I may hate it. I may be violently opposed, but at least it's predictable. Whereas now the instability inside of our own country is causing our politicians to really have to look inward, to be very cognizant of an increasingly divided constituency. And they now have to make policies that maybe are not economically the best policy, but they soothe the most people that vote for them.
Absolutely. I mean, industrial policy has become a much greater driver, and it doesn't matter if it's helping or hurting the American economy. And that's even true when you talk about American consumers and taxpayers. I mean, think about how many folks have been behind higher tariffs on Chinese goods. And Trump said, they're paying for that. They're paying for that. No, they're not. American consumers are paying for that. But it is politically completely toxic to talk about reducing tariffs against Chinese exports to the US. And it doesn't matter what the economic sensibility of that happens to be. And we can play that through in all. I'm all in favor of investing in American human capital and infrastructure. I think the CHIPS Act was great. I'm glad we're rebuilding bridges again. You know, I mean, Lord knows we need to be, have a high-speed rail system. I'd like it to be private sector, but if the public sector can help make it happen faster, God bless. Those things are happening. But at the global level, the Americans are now politically throwing all sorts of wrenches into globalization. And in part, that's because a lot of Americans feel like they didn't benefit from globalization. So why should we support that? You know, you're going to take my job and my livelihood and you're going to send it to China? Screw you. I'm not going to support that. And it is true that if the American economy grows like Topsy, but the middle class and the working class is treated like cannon fodder, then they're not going to be very interested in promoting your policy. So globalization is absolutely great for the United States, but globalism sucks for the average American. And that is where you see policymakers like Trump and Bernie Sanders, frankly, and AOC, it's both sides of the spectrum, making bank in this environment. Because people out there, so many people say the system doesn't work, they're lying to me, so I want someone who's going to break things. I want someone who's going to take the fight, because otherwise it's never going to get fixed. And Trump is someone who, you know, just by dint of the fact that he drives the establishment so insane, he drives the media so insane, he drives the political leaders so insane, that you know that he's really fighting those guys. So if you really feel like things are broken in the US and the only thing you see is a small pocket of people that keep benefiting, it's never hitting you, you're willing to roll the dice on someone that's going to be a chaos agent. And Trump is that. Trump is that.
Is the system broken, and are they lying to us?
I think that the American system, in many ways, is unrepresentative of the average American. I mean, just the fact that the U.S. is now, of all of the OECD economies, the U.S. is the country where you can best predict a person's wealth as an adult on the basis of their parents' wealth, more than any other OECD economy. And when you and I were kids, that wasn't true. That's a sign of a broken system. I thought that the Varsity Blues case, when we saw all of these entitled adults doing everything they could to make sure their kids were getting into Ivy League schools and thinking they were doing nothing wrong because that's the way the system works, that is, in my mind, the sign of an unrepresentative system. You know, we see examples of that all the time. And I do think the fact that the average American doesn't trust their political institutions anymore is not the fault of the working class. That's the fault of the people that have been leaders. And it's not just a communications failure. It is an execution failure. They just haven't made it work for enough Americans. And people are taking advantage of that. And there's a lot of disinformation. And I do believe that, I mean, a number of policies we've seen in the last few years are going to move the needle over time. I was a big fan of the Inflation Reduction Act. And by the way, more red state jobs than blue state jobs under the Inflation Reduction Act, which was a bipartisan piece of legislation. But that will take 10 or 20 years before it actually starts to change the way people think about their opportunities. It doesn't happen overnight, not when for 40, 50 years they've been on the wrong side of that. So, you know, I do think that there are big things. You look at how much money there is in the American political system, the billions of dollars that are spent on election cycles that go for more than a year, and they are spending that money. And a lot of that money is dark money. We can't even find out who's behind it and where it's going. And we know that the purpose of that money is to perpetuate special interests in their ability to capture the regulatory process and make politicians work for them and not the average American. I mean, when we see things, even like the NRA, and we know that the average American wants a different policy, but it can't happen because there's too much money that pays to ensure that it doesn't. And that happens, by the way, with teachers unions and police unions too, you know, and ensuring that the system is broken and doesn't work properly for their kids. Yeah, that is for me a sign of a system that is deeply sclerotic, that is unrepresentative. It's not completely unfunctional, and partially because we're so wealthy and we have so much entrepreneurship and we're in such a wonderful location geographically and we have so many natural resources. I mean, there's so many things that America has going for it that you can tolerate a lot of things that are really broken in your political system, and the country can still work. But honestly, is America's political system in crisis? Yes, I think it is. I think it is. And I say that as someone who has a lot of friends in government, Democrats and Republicans, who I think are trying to do the right thing. But the system is pretty broken right now. Yeah, I think it is.
All right. So are they lying to us?
Who's they?
People are going to say the elites, the government, mainstream media. We'll start there. Those two.
I think that a lot of the we must consume, the presumptions of what goes behind capitalism. Let me give you an example. You know how much young people care about climate. You know how much they care about the environment. They've been lied to. We've been lied to for decades by very, very powerful organizations that had a lot to lose by admitting that climate change was happening, that it was transformative in bad ways, and that they were responsible for it. Yeah. Are they lying to us? Yeah. And then, by the way, when they finally admitted it, they still did everything they could privately to prevent us from taking action that would have made this a lot cheaper to deal with, a lot less costly to deal with. Are they lying to us? Yeah. Did the tobacco companies lie to us about the fact that the products that they were selling, they were trying to addict us to, were going to kill us? Yeah, they lied. They lied to us. Were the food companies lying to us when they did everything possible to ensure the production of salty and sweet and fatty, because that's what we would buy more of for our short-term interests, and sell them in bigger and bigger quantities? Were they lying to? Yeah, they were lying to us. They're not taking care of us. They're treating us as products. They're treating us as things that are useful to them. And were there members of government that happily went along with that because they were on the payroll of those lobbies? Yes, of course. Absolutely. And I think that, like, my mom raising me, she was aware of that. She wasn't going to make a sophisticated argument. She wasn't going to develop a documentary, but at base level, she understood that the advertisements that we were seeing and the campaign speeches that we were digesting were not good for her kids. I think she fundamentally understood that, and she was angry about it. She accepted it. That's the way the system kind of worked, that they were all trying to screw each other. But she also recognized, and you said it yourself, how you were born in terms of class, as people that didn't have the education, didn't have the network, didn't have the money, that we were going to get screwed. That's not what America's supposed to be about. America's supposed to be the country where everyone can make it. That's what the American dream is. And fewer Americans believe in the American dream today. Now, that's accurate. It's harder to actually have upward mobility in this environment. People, a country that has been very optimistic, that historically large majorities of Americans, when polled, would say, I'm going to make it to the top 10%. And if I don't, my kids will. I mean, so many people saying that it wasn't conceivably true, but they believed it. And that made you happier. And it made you happy in part because you did kind of trust a lot of those people that were elites. And that has gone away, in my view. Absolutely, it has.
Do you think the same they lied to us about things like masks because they really believe that we have to get people to believe this to protect them?
I really, really was disappointed with Fauci. I mean, it was pretty clear that he was marketing to Americans because he thought he knew better and that we couldn't handle the truth. And of course, when you do that in the near term and you find out in the long term, what that does is it helps the conspiracy theorists, right? I mean, it's true that there was a lot that Americans really didn't know about this disease in the early stages. But I mean, saying, hey, an N95 is the best thing to do, but we don't want you wearing those because we really need those for the people that are in, sort of critical hospital care and the rest. Like, I think that's what he should have said. I don't think he should have lied to Americans in the early days, because I think it did enormous damage, especially because of the political divisions in this country. I think the CDC has taken a massive hit of trust and has become politicized in the United States. And we need to be able to believe our doctors and our scientists. We need that. So yeah, I feel like Fauci. I've been to Fauci's office. I interviewed him a couple of times for my own show. And he's a very charismatic guy, and he's friendly, and he's smart, and he touches you when he talks. But I mean, his office was a shrine. I can't remember the last time I had seen an office that had so many commendations and photos with him and every political leader from every walk of life that he had, like on every wall, floor to ceiling. And I've seen that. That the fact that you want to show off the fact that you have a lot of access can serve many purposes. And if as long as you're focused first and foremost on content, first and foremost on the science, but I fear that at least the Fauci that I met was focusing more on the media, the attention, the brand, the power, and less on the outcomes. And I think that did a lot of damage. This is just my personal impression. I'm not a doctor. I'm not a scientist, right? I'm just being honest with you and telling you what I think because you asked me the question. I mean, we went through this pandemic, and that should have been an opportunity for us to invest more in early stage warning, and in education, and in strengthening the World Health Organization, for example. And none of that happened. All it did was breed more mistrust. Now, thank God, we have some extraordinary scientists in the private sector, like in Moderna and like in Pfizer and others, that were able to develop vaccines like with incredible speed and are now using those technologies to do all sorts of new things that are helping us with cancer and Alzheimer's and you name it. But the government and the mistrust that average Americans, average citizens have in what the doctors are telling us, especially those that are like on TV and that have some level of, where the elite doctors that you're supposed to listen to. I think that you'll listen to your own GC, but you won't, GP, but you won't listen to those guys. I think it's a horrible thing.
How often are you checking your credit score, afraid of identity theft or account breaches? We all use the internet every single day for important things like personal banking and remote work, so why not protect yourself with our sponsor, Aura? Aura is an all-in-one cybersecurity service that keeps you safe online. Aura identifies data brokers exposing your info and submits opt-out requests on your behalf. Aura also monitors your credit, tracks your passwords for data breaches, and secures your online activity with VPN and anti-malware protection. You can try Aura for free for 2 weeks by clicking the link in the description or scanning the QR code. One of the things that I talk to people about a lot is, hey, look, lying is a powerful tactic, but be careful, because if you use it, it will work sometimes, and then other times you will just become known as a liar. And when I look at the division that we're going through right now, and what is it, about this moment, and I can't speak to whether the rest of the world is falling prey to the same thing or not, but in a world where anybody can pick up their phone and live stream to the rest of the world, your lies are going to be found out terrifyingly fast, and that is going to absolutely erode your credibility. And on top of that, now you get into a position where there's just the level of disdain and distrust that people are going to have creates the level of animosity towards the government that we're seeing now. And that's where you get that powder keg, where all of a sudden a country which has a host of problems just all coming together at one moment really starts to be super unnerving. But when I look out at what I would want people to take away, because I'm very much an individualistic thinker in that I think at the level of the individual. So I'm not good at what you're good at, which is global geopolitics. Like, you see how all the puzzle pieces add up. What I understand is the person. And so I will say, look, everybody, of course, that people are lying to you. It is a tool in everyone's arsenal. And the vast majority of humans are going to deploy that tool, even if only to make you feel like your ass doesn't look big in those jeans, right? It's just, it is going to be used. So the thing that you can do is not be as gullible. I never thought I would be interviewing people on geopolitics, but once I started feeling like society is beginning to fray, and it's beginning to fray because people are not building their own internal model of what they believe the world is. They're letting the algorithms do that for them. They don't understand how they're being manipulated, and therefore they become easy to manipulate. And so the thing that I'm hoping to do with the show, because all I've ever wanted to do is empower people to make decisions that make their life better. And I suddenly realized that people really need to understand how the game works. Once you understand how the game works, hopefully you can stop being mad about it and just start doing something about it. But speaking of doing something about it, when you look at, so we've got two wars that are happening right now, one potential war in air quotes, because you've made it very clear you don't actually think that America's going to be in a hot civil war.
Right.
But how does this all play out? Like, I've heard you talk about Ukraine is just going to have to accept that they are partitioned. But also it felt like you had some anxiety about Trump coming in and just being like, you're going to have to accept that you're partitioned. What is the, oh man, you talk about the risk assessment that you guys do is based on fact, not preference. So knowing that you're not about to lay out your preference, what do you think is the actual path forward?
And this
for
also,
both
I mean, that last
Russia,
point,
Ukraine, and Israel-Hamas?
that last point just links so much with what you were saying before. Like, I have no problem with being wrong. At the end of the year, we go back and we see how we did on all this stuff, and we, see like how that affects when we do get stuff wrong. Why did we get it wrong? What lessons do we take away from it? But the authenticity is absolutely critical. I mean, for someone who's not a part of a political party and who travels all over the world, I feel like, 5-10 years ago, I spent most of my time talking with and engaging with elites because I thought, well, those are the people with power, and that's going to have the biggest impact in affecting change. But in an environment, as you say, Tom, where so many people are being, driven by misinformation, becoming angry, becoming polarized, I feel like I have to spend a lot more of my time just talking to people. Right. Just like being authentic about what's happening in the world. And, it's not easy to, sort of ball that up into pro-Trump or pro-Biden or pro-American or pro-anything, frankly. But we need more of that. We need people that are prepared to like meet people where they are, listen to them, and talk about what we think is really happening in the world. And it's okay if you don't agree with all of it, because it's not about agreeing. It's about understanding. That's all it is. And so there, you're right.
So using my words, the book kind of wants for a crisis, hence the title, The Power of Crisis.
A little bit.
You call it the Goldilocks crisis, something that is devastating enough that people stop and pay attention, but not so devastating that we can't respond well to it. Is that the only way to get people to act, to cooperate in the way that we would need to cooperate? And does it, like, when you think about the ideal state of the world, is it globalized or sensibly deglobalized?
First of all, it's a great question. And it's not like you can never make progress outside of crisis. Progress happens all the time outside of crisis. We see new legislation that gets passed. We see, new companies that are started. We see we see good works by people of other people on the street, But it's one thing to say, can't we get the progress we need? In a family, you can. In a community, you can. When you're working together well within an alliance, you frequently can. In what I call a G0 world, where there's not a level of functional global leadership, where countries aren't working together well, they don't trust each other, they don't have, the institutions that align with the balance of powers today. So it's not a G7 or a G20. It's really an absence of global leadership. I think in an environment like that, by far the most likely way to get an effective response, just like with the Soviets versus the Americans, Reagan versus Gorbachev in the opening of my book, is if you have a crisis, if the aliens come down. And, it turned out that the pandemic wasn't a big enough crisis. Didn't kill young people. It wasn't. I mean, look at what happened. The Americans pull out of the World Health Organization. The Chinese lie to everybody about not being transferred human to human. The relationship got worse between the two countries. The Americans, we didn't provide vaccines to the poor countries around the world, even though we had people in the United States that didn't need them and were waiting on, that already took them and were waiting on boosters. Like it was a complete clusterfuck. Pardon my French. And it's because it didn't feel like an existential crisis. It wasn't big enough to force us to cooperate to a greater degree. January 6th in the United States. I mean, maybe if Pence had been hung, maybe if some, I mean, God forbid, maybe if members of the House or Senate had been killed or injured or kidnapped for a period of time. But as it stood, that evening, a majority of Republicans in the House voted not to certify the outcome. Why not? Because they're focused on the jobs, because they knew it wasn't a constitutional crisis. They knew it wasn't a coup. So I do think that in this environment, in a dysfunctional governance environment, where people don't trust each other at the highest levels that are in power, where we don't have the institutions that can work, are proven to work to respond to the crises in front of us, yeah, we need a crisis. And the good news is that climate is clearly not only a big enough crisis, but also one that humanity, I think, is up for. And so that is forcing us. Every year, we actually are radically exceeding in renewable energy production and reduced cost from what the International Energy Agency is predicting. Every year for decades now, we've been exceeding that. And that's because this crisis has been big enough and it's affecting everyone to mobilize our asses into action. And the question is AI a crisis that we can actually effectively respond to? There's no question. The size is suitably great that it should motivate us. And when I talk to government leaders around the world today, they are focused. They are focused on it. They're focused on it because of the size of the crisis, but also it's very interesting. So the US government, it's not just because they're suddenly all experts in AI. It's also because the three things that they are most concerned about as national security priorities, which is confrontation with China, war between Russia and Ukraine and proxy war with the Russians, and threat to the US democracy, they think, and they're right, that all of these are dramatically transformed by AI developments. So not only is AI coming as a big new thing, but also all the things they're already worried about, spending a lot of time and money on, and blood, are things that they better figure this out or they're in trouble. So I do think the motivation to get this right is going to be there. I hope we're up for it. And again, I'm an optimist. I'm hopeful. I mean, at the end of the day, I mean, the fact that we're here and we're talking about it means that we're capable of doing something.
My only fear is that with global warming, you can't win global warming and get a leg up over China or Russia, but you can win AI and get a leg up and be better. And I think that one thing that people aren't talking about enough for sure is that AI is going to be an adversarial system, meaning bad guys are going to have AI and they're going to try to do things to hurt me with that AI. And then others are going to build AI that is protective and try to stop the bad guys. And so you will have, just like with normal hacking, you'll have an ever escalating arms race of AI. And so even if only with the best of intentions, we will end up getting to AI superintelligence because we're trying to stop somebody from doing a bad thing. And go ahead.
I was going to say, that's a really good point. And I've given a lot of thought to that because, look, we don't trust the Chinese at all. They don't trust us. They've invested billions and tens of billions of dollars into next generation nuclear, wind, solar, electric vehicles, and the supply chains for all of that. Now, there are a lot of people around the country that are not particularly focused on climate, but they're focused on China. And they're saying, hey, we cannot let those guys become the energy superpower post-carbon. We've got to invest in it so that we're going to be the energy superpower. But the good thing about that is, hey, that's virtuous competition. Like, if we end up investing more so that we're the dominant superpower, that just means cheaper post-carbon energy faster for everybody. But in the AI space, it is absolutely unclear that there is a virtuous cycle of competition if we are not working together. The proliferation risk is much, much greater. I couldn't agree with you more on that point.
Yeah. So now the question becomes, when you look at what we get on the other side of the crisis, the cooperation, the banding together to focus on one problem, does that lead us back to globalization? So we opened this up with globalization, amazing. We were lifting some like 160,000 people out of poverty every day for like 9 years. It was absolutely crazy, the number of people that we pulled out of poverty. But you get the Rust Belt pushback, rise of populism. It's not good for everybody. And so needing to really be honest about that. But in this world, let's say that we get the right crisis. What are we steering towards? Is it reglobalization, or is it what I'm calling thoughtful deglobalization?
I think we are trying to move back towards globalization, but thoughtful globalization, where you are using the resources you have to more effectively take care of the people that are left behind, that you are constantly retooling your institutions and reforming them because the technologies are changing that fast. And that's something governments by themselves won't be able to do. Again, they'll have to do in concert with these new technology companies, or governments will have to change what they are. They'll have to integrate technology companies into them. And that scares you. That's more of an authoritarian model, frankly. But I do think that one of the reasons you've steered me a couple times now in a direction that historically I'd be very easily steered, which is to talk about US versus China. And I've resisted it. And the reason I've resisted it, even though US-China is in a horrible place right now and the relationship is getting worse, it's not getting better. But I think it is more likely within 3-5 years that AI companies, cutting edge, in all sorts of fields, will actually be all over the world. I think this is going to be a proliferating technology for good and for bad. So I'm more concerned about individuals, rogue states, terrorist organizations doing crazy things, as opposed to the US versus China that ultimately want stability in the system, right? But I'm also hopeful that it's not going to be a small number of dominant companies in the United States and China that control all of the next generation AI. Actually, if you're at a position where you can run a near cutting edge AI on your own laptop or on your smartphone, and millions of people have access to that intelligence and they can do things with it, I don't think that a small number of mega tech corporations are going to control it. I mean, they may have platforms that they'll be able to charge taxes on, basically tariffs on, but I think so much of both the value, the upside, and the danger will be distributed all over the world. And that's, again, very different than the way we think about geopolitics today. So I don't think the US, on the AI front, I don't think the US-China fight is the principal concern to worry about in the next 5 to 10 years.
Ooh, okay. Well, so this is very interesting. One of the things that you talked about in the book is that when Russia invaded the Ukraine, one of the things that they did to try to appease the West and keep them calm was like, hey, we know you're really worried about hackers. We're going to go round them up, arrest them. And what happens to the ability to use political means to get these bad actors in line if they are proliferated everywhere and we have varying degrees of ability to influence?
Yeah, it's one of the reasons why I think you don't have an Interpol model or an IAEA model. It's why I think it's going to have to be much more inclusive with the technology companies. I keep coming back to this. I don't think that the US government by itself or the Russian government would be able to make that kind of a promise as easily. Russians are a little bit different here, right? If you're an authoritarian state and you have real control of the information space, maybe the vast majority of people working on hacking are under your authority, maybe. But if AI really becomes as explosive and as decentralized as I believe it will, then the governments by themselves are going to have a hard time even maintaining control of the AI space. So I'm not sure the Chinese model on this is going to work. I mean, in 5 and 10 years' time. Remember, they gave up on the Great Chinese Firewall. And instead, because it was too porous, and instead what they did was they used the surveillance mechanisms, and they had a whole bunch of people that were online that were basically nudging Chinese citizens towards better behavior and towards certain things that they should say and against certain things they didn't say. And that turned out to be more effective. AI, I think, is going to become, if it becomes a much more decentralized space, it's going to be much, much harder for an authoritarian state to do that. But certainly it'll be impossible for a democratic state to do it. Now, the question you haven't asked me is, does that mean that democracy is sustainable? I mean, if the U.S. government feels immediate national security threat from all these tech companies and they can't regulate it, might the Americans start finding the Chinese model on AI much more attractive? I don't think so. And I don't think so. Why? Because I think our system is so entrenched. It's so slow moving. It's so receptive to money. The companies are so wealthy. They have the ability to capture the regulatory environment. Like, again, I mean, never say never. It can happen here. If things are incredibly dangerous, yes. I mean, you can take desperate measures. But short of the worst scenarios, I think that the United States is closer to kleptocracy than it is to authoritarian regime. If there's a way that the Americans are going to move away from democracy, it's probably not a Chinese model, right?
Well, that's horrifying. My hope, it's funny, my brain tried to fill in what you were going to say, and your answer is probably more true than what I was hoping you were going to say. But what I was hoping you were going to say was that we have such a strong shared narrative around freedom that we wouldn't make those. He laughs, ladies and gentlemen, he laughs. Yeah, man.
Oh my God, that used to be true when my dad was alive, and after World War II, I just don't see it anymore. I mean, not unless everyone's lying to the pollsters all the time. It just doesn't feel that way.
Yeah,
I don't think we agree in the United States what our country stands for. I don't think we do. I don't think we know what our country stands for. There's such incredible cynicism among young people that they're just being lied to, that it's performative from their governments, from their corporations, from everybody, from the media. And some of it is very understandable. It's painful, but like our economy is doing so well. Our technology is doing so well. We have the reserve currency. It's not being threatened. We are in a great geography. It's very safe. It's very stable. There are so many things that are great. I saw that Jamie Dimon, a few minutes that everyone was talking about standing up for America, but he didn't talk about our political system. And our political system is deteriorating, and people don't believe in it the way they used to. And I've not seen any pushback against that in the last 20 years. It got worse under Obama. It got worse under Trump. It's gotten worse under Biden. It's clearly not just about those people. It's structural. There are a lot of things driving it. That I don't see God forbid if we had a 9/11 right now. I mean, I was in New York at 9/11. I saw the second tower go down. I saw the way that New York City rallied. I saw the way the country rallied. There was 92% approval for Bush a month after.
Young people will not understand how crazy that is.
And I don't think that could happen today. I don't think it could happen even with someone who is as much of a unifier as Biden has been historically, and it certainly couldn't happen under Trump. And that's really sad. That's really sad.
Do you have a sense of how we unwind that? This is the one thing my thesis has been on this, that until there is enough pain and suffering, which unfortunately historically means war, you don't get the country won't come back together, right? So we've obviously been more divided than we are now because we've been in open civil war in the past. But I don't see how you unwind these increasingly divergent narratives of left and right without real suffering.
Well, I mean, there was this great book that was written by a Princeton historian about the three great levelers, and it talked about how in societies whatever the governance mechanism historically, they tend to get more unequal, and people with access to power get closer access to power over time, unless one of three big things happen: famine, revolution, or war. And that's a little depressing, because that implies that you have to have that kind of great, kind of serious crackdown crash before you come out and create more opportunities for people. But I also am seeing, coming out of the pandemic, there was an enormous amount of money that was spent on poor people. It wasn't just like after 2008 when you bailed out AIG and Lehman Brothers and the bankers. This time around, you bailed out everybody. You bailed out working mothers. You bailed out small and medium enterprises, and it made a difference. And inflation has hit hard, but now finally, working class wages are actually growing faster than inflation and then the average wage. And that wasn't true for decades. So maybe there is a bit of a lesson in that. Maybe there is a bit of a lesson when people are seeing that, it's the wealthiest with their legacy capabilities that are getting accepted to the major universities, the best universities, and not others. And there's a backlash against that. And maybe that forces greater transparency. Maybe it turns out that AI becomes, with all the wealth it can generate, becomes more of a leveler for people in the United States that will have access to opportunities they hadn't had before. Maybe it allows globalization to pick up again, and not everybody's boat will rise at the same speed, but at least everyone's boat will be rising for a while. Look, coming out of the pandemic, we had 50 years. If we look at humanity as, this little ball of 8 billion people, we had 50 years where overall we had extraordinary growth. And if you watched Steven Pinker and Hans Rosling and all of these pro-globalization folks, it is true. We created not just very, very wealthy people, but also a global middle class. And anyone looking at the globe, without a nationality, just like you're an average person, you don't know where you're going to be born. You don't know what family. Would you want to be born in the last 50 years? Yes. Yes, you would. And hopefully you win the lottery and you're in the United States, like you and me. But, anywhere. If you that's the time you'd pick. But the last 3 years, you wouldn't, because the last 3 years, suddenly human development indicators have gone down. More people are, forced migrants. More people are, born into extreme poverty, and people are getting angrier as a consequence of that. Well, I think there's a good chance that with AI, we will have a new globalization that will create far more opportunities, but we need to be very careful about those negative externalities. And so far, it's very early days, but we're not addressing them yet.
So given all of that, paint a picture for me of the near term. Let's call it the next 10 years. The world is shifting and changing. What does the world order look like as we look out into the future? And I'll contextualize that with, you've got things we've talked about here. You've got the war in Ukraine. You've got a dynamic between the US and China being radically upended by the proliferation of AI, creating potentially powerful or at least destructive entities anywhere, which make it harder for us to yank levers of political persuasion. With all of the unique cocktail that's brewing now, how does one begin to conceptualize where the world is heading over the next 10 years?
Well, I can't imagine wanting to be alive at any other time. We talk about the Anthropocene, where human beings, first time in history, we have the ability to actually shape the future of humanity and our role on the planet that we're on. That's pretty extraordinary. And what does that mean? I think that means that governments and governance will look radically different than anything that we have lived with. We've lived for all of our lives, for 50 years, you and I, on average now, we've lived in a fairly stable system. The Soviet Union collapsed. US was in charge. China's had an extraordinary rise. But generally speaking, the global order today still looks more or less like the global order you had 50 years ago. Henry Kissinger recognizes it, right? He was 50, now he's 100. But it feels like geopolitics still function the way they used to. You've got heads of state, you got governance, you still have the UN, you've got the IMF, you've got the World Trade Organization, you've got these big things. that more or less, I mean, I was just at the Security Council. Security Council is kind of the same Security Council we had before from the 70s, but whatever. It's not. It's the rules, the UN Charter. It's all there. It's you could have been born a long time ago. In 10 years' time, I think we'll still recognize the tectonics on the planet. I think the demographics we can talk about. We can talk about how Japan will be smaller and how China's peaked out and how India's growing, and that we pretty good sense in that. Climate, we've got a pretty good sense of what climate's going to look like and extreme storms and the rest. But government, how government works, how the geopolitics work, how the world is ordered, ruled, I think it's going to look radically different in 10 years. I really do. Certainly in 20, but probably in 10. I think that a big piece of the power that determines who we are and how we interact with people will be driven by a very small number of human beings that control these tech companies that may or may not know what they're doing, and that may or may not be with intentionality, and we don't really know what their goals are, and those goals can change, right? I mean, I talked a little bit in my TED Talk, which I haven't really talked much about, which is kind of good, I talked a little bit about how, when you and I were raised, it was nature or nurture. And that determined who we were. And that now, for the first time in humanity, we are being raised by algorithm. And that we have a whole generation of kids whose principal understanding of how to interact with society will be intermediated by programmed algorithms that have no interest in the education of that child. That is a subsidiary impact of what they are trying to do. Those algorithms, what it is trying to do, and a lot of the interactions that will take place with those kids will be AI interactions, not just intermediated, but the actual relationship will be with AI. Which, by the way, if I could wave a magic wand and do one regulation in the world today, I would say anyone under 16 cannot interact with an AI directly as if it were a human being, unless it's under direct human supervision. Because I just don't want people to be raised by anything other than people until we understand what that means. I mean,
even at the level of education.
Again, I want that to be directly controlled by, supervised by a person. So yes, I think education, I think a doctor, I'd love to have AI being used, for medical, on medical apps for kids. But I'm saying if you're having a relationship with something, including with a teacher, I don't want kids to have a relationship with an AI educator unless it's overseen by an adult, until we know what it does to the kids. We just don't know. We just don't know. And I worry about that a lot. I don't have kids. If I had them, I'd worry about that. I know my mom wouldn't have allowed that, and thank God for it. So yeah, I think that we're going to be different as human beings. I mean, you talked about Yuval Noah Harari recently, who I find very inspirational as a thinker. And this homo deus concept that he comes up with. I think that young people today are already something a little different from Homo sapiens. And I don't know exactly what that is. None of us do, because we're running the experiments on them now. I'm not comfortable with that.
In modern day America, could we actually find ourselves in civil war?
No. In fact, since you're asking that question, I literally just a few moments ago responded to someone. It was David Rothkopf. I did not have full-fledged civil war on my bingo card for 2024. I think I need a new bingo card. And I wrote, I would definitely stick with your old bingo card. So no, I understand that we have like 25 governors that are all lined up saying, got to defend the border and don't want to listen to the Supreme Court. This is not about civil war. This is about a democracy in crisis. This is about two sides that are very antagonistic towards each other. The stakes are very high, especially for the leaders of both of these political parties. And there is no effort to engage in diplomacy. There's no effort to see things from the perspective of the other side. And in fact, they really don't even share basic understanding of political facts. And when you look at that and you compare it to Russia versus Ukraine or Israel versus Hamas, then you start to see that there is a real line through of comparison. And that is unfortunate. It's not that we're going to start blowing ourselves up. It's more that we aren't capable of having a free and fair election that the entire country believes in anymore. And that's kind of foundational to a well-functioning democracy. But unfortunately, that's not where we are this year.
Okay. Definitely what I was hoping you were going to say, but now set the table for us. When I read the report that you put out, you list the United States against itself as the #1 threat that we face. Why? Walk me through when you talk about, you've said social media is an existential threat to democracy. Obviously, we've got Trump versus Biden as the likely race. What are the pieces that are on this, maybe chessboard is a better analogy, that have you listing this as the #1 concern?
Well, first, let me explain what it means to be #1. So what's the methodology behind my madness, right? What we're looking at, we're measuring likelihood, imminence, and impact. And so, I mean, if you look at this year's report, Africa's not in it. Why not? I mean, all sorts of horrible things that are really risky are happening in Africa, but the economic and diplomatic and security impact on the rest of the world is negligible. And I'm sorry to have to say that, but it is what it is. Like, I can't make it other than what it is. And where in the United States, the fact that the U.S. democratic process is pretty broken, and that is having a significant impact on policies that the U.S. enacts with massive implications for the rest of the world, because the U.S. is by far the strongest economy in the world. It's by far the strongest military in the world. Like, that's why there's such outsized impact from the United States. It's a big deal. So, for example, Trump has not yet got the nomination. He will, right? I mean, I think that's pretty much 100% short of a really unforeseen health event. There's really no mechanism for anyone to get, for Nikki Haley to get a single state. I expect that she'll drop out before South Carolina because she's not going to want to lose her home state by 30 points. I think she's politically savvy enough to avoid that fate. But even before Trump gets the nomination, just by putting his thumb on the scale and saying, I don't want a deal on the border in return for $61 billion of Ukraine aid, because I want to run on that issue against Biden, who's failing on the border right now, and Mitch McConnell, who is no Trump fan, but is now loyal because Trump now owns the Republican Party again, gets on board. And the Speaker of the House gets on board. And so what happens to Ukraine? You're not getting that $61 billion. So is that a risk of Ukraine, or is that a risk of the United States? Oh, that's a risk of the United States. And, I spend a lot of my time talking to leaders of different governments around the world. They are maximally concerned about this. Chinese leadership, far more concerned about the U.S. election than the election in Taiwan, for example, where so many people were saying, oh, it could be war, it could be confrontation. No, they're worried about the U.S. The Europeans are worried about the U.S. The Mexicans and Canadians are worried about the U.S. So that's why there are such major knock-on implications from this election.
All right. When they say they're worried, what is the doomsday scenario for people? So there's, assuming that you're right, Trump is going to be running against Biden. One of the two is going to win. If you were to play out the scenarios, one, let me ask you, if the election were held today, who would win?
I'd say Trump would win today fairly handily. I would say in November right now, my view is 60-40 Trump. But I have very low confidence in saying that because there's so much that can happen in the next 9 months.
Fair. Okay, so let's run those scenarios. What One, talk to me about the lead up, because that's the thing I think is a huge litmus test. If you were to ask me what I've spent the most time thinking about, it's what does it look like in a world with AI at the level that it's at, in an election that is so contentious and so high stakes globally? What does that look like? But then also, I want to specifically walk through the scenarios of what does the world look like, say, in the immediate 6 months after a Trump victory? What does the world look like in an immediate 6 months after a Biden victory?
Well, so first of all, the stakes are so much higher for these individual leaders. If Trump loses, he's going to jail. And I mean, we've got 91 indictments. There will almost certainly be convictions, at least in the Washington, D.C. case before the election, though he'll be out on bail. But so the stakes for Trump are far higher than they were before. That means the implications of him losing is something he needs to avoid at all costs. The efforts that he and many of his supporters will take to avoid that, and maybe even to interfere with that, are far greater than they would have been in 2020 or in 2016. And certainly the impact, if Biden wins, of Trump then going to jail and taking the government taking that action against him, after you will have heard the entire Republican Party saying that these cases are fake and they're politicized and they're trumped up and they're a witch hunt. And they will say that because they will all be loyal to and endorsing Trump, has the potential to have far more disruption from saying that the election was rigged. So assuming it's not a massive landslide where you can't get away with saying that, Trump would still say it, but that you can't, it doesn't make sense. Then, I do think there's a much greater likelihood that you will have civil disobedience, social instability, violence in a lot of red states, in a lot of red cities, and unwillingness to accept a Biden administration as legitimate president in 2025. I think that's a very big and real possibility. Now, if Trump wins, there are several things that are really different this time around from 2016. One thing that is different is his priorities. His first priority has to be to end all of the investigations against him, to politicize the DOJ and the FBI and the IRS that he believes are already politicized against him, and impose his own loyalists on those in the bureaucracies of those organizations, so that he can go after his enemies that want to lock him up. He's going to want to lock them up. And indeed, there are many senior advisors to Biden that feel like they're likely to be imprisoned if Trump is able to pull that off. So we're talking here something that looks a lot more like Peru or Hungary than looks like Canada or Japan or Germany, right? And we're normalizing all of this because, we're getting used to it over a number of years. We're like, okay, well, now we have presidents that get impeached a couple of times and the impeachment's kind of broken. It's only political. So, okay, that's the way it works. And, we see what happened with the Speaker of the House, who's thrown out by a small number of caucusing members of his own party. And that means that you can't promote legislation that they don't like. That's the way it works now. That's not the way it's worked historically. And it's not the way a functional democracy works. But in this environment, if Trump wins, that is what we're looking at. And then there's also the international environment, which is very, very different. 2016 to 2020, there really weren't any major global crises going on while Trump was president. This time around, Trump will be president with a minimum of two major wars that are going on. And he's promised he will end the war in Ukraine on the first day. He says it's just a talking point. He says it all the time. What he means is that he will force the Ukrainians to accept the present delineation of land. And when they refuse, they will be cut off. They'll say, you get a ceasefire for that. Well, they say, no. This is an existential crisis for NATO and for the EU, because there are a lot of frontline countries that think that that is an unacceptable outcome. But there are others, like Hungary and Slovakia, as well as political movements inside Europe that are gaining in popularity, like the New National Front in France or like the Alternatives for Deutschland in Germany, that will be aligned with Trump, not with their governments. And Trump will reach out to them in directly engaged foreign policy, something that absolutely isn't happening right now under the Biden administration. And we've had for the last several years a very coordinated NATO and transatlantic relationship. This suddenly becomes an immediate crisis for the Europeans and for NATO. So, I mean, just to play out a little bit of what that means, that's some of what we should be thinking about. And it's certainly a lot of what American allies are thinking about as we head into this election season.
Okay, so I want to go back to the civil unrest. So if Biden is elected, what do you like? Let's use 2020 as our benchmark. So we had a lot of civil unrest in 2020. Having lived through it in LA, where a lot of it was popping off, it was serious. But certainly seeing that sort of move through the system, obviously we were nowhere near that spilling over into a civil war. That to me feels like peak sort of Tinder pile, given that we had all been locked down. And so there was just a sort of screaming sense of injustice everywhere. And then you get to January 6th, which I guess technically was 2021. And again, now we've been locked up even longer, and there's a real undercurrent of not only is there a massive amount of social injustice, but there's also the government may actually be becoming tyrannical. And so that felt like a powder keg moment that I don't feel like we will have in 2024's election, barring an economic turn. So if you had to gauge off of the instability that we had in that period versus what you expect after this election, if Biden wins, where do you peg that level of reaction?
Yeah, I think, first of all, I think the global challenges are much greater than the domestic ones. So you mentioned the point, barring an economic unforeseen issue in the U.S., performance of the U.S. economy is actually quite strong right now. Now, people don't necessarily feel that way because the leading indicator that determines how you feel about the economy in the U.S. is what your political affiliation is, which is senseless, but is true. And that gets to the problem of democracy, the completely different information environments. But you certainly do not have people locked down under the pandemic. You certainly do not have an economy that is in crisis. But other economies around the world are going to get hit very badly by this. This is U.S. democracy in crisis is a much bigger problem for the economies in Europe, for example, or in Asia, for example, than they are for the United States. And that is, meaningful. But the risk report that we write is a global report. It's not just a report that looks at the United States domestically. So I do think it is the geopolitical backdrop of this instability and the erosion of political institutions in the United States that poses a big issue. I mean, remember, Trump came in last time around and he pulls the U.S. out of the Trans-Pacific Partnership. This ends those negotiations, pulls the U.S. out of the Paris climate talks, pulls the U.S. out of the Iranian nuclear deal, all of these things, but they happen in peacetime. And so it doesn't really matter that much. That happens in wartime when people are feeling crises and when other countries are feeling major economic stress after 3 years of pandemic. That's a very different story. So if anything, this would make me more structurally bullish on the dollar and on the U.S. stock market, because in a world that is much more unstable, you're going to the cleanest dirty shirt. And that's not crypto, right? I mean, it's not NFTs. And it's certainly not China.
How dare you, Ian Bremmer?
I'm sorry. It's certainly not China, which is facing very serious, so serious economic challenges that they really don't want Trump. And they had no problem with Trump in 2016. And this time around, they're saying, we can't handle the chaos. We just want a stable election, So that is really interesting. I don't think there'll be another January 6th because everything will be locked down around that. The preparations for that will be in place. I think it's much more likely the kind of instability we'll see will be much more like what we had in Portland, Oregon, But again, in red states, where you have large numbers of disenfranchised MAGA types, who are many of whom are armed, many of whom will see a Biden administration, as a second Biden administration, as an absolute destruction of everything that they see as holy. And they will likely be supported by a lot of local police and maybe some local members of the armed forces. And that's a fairly serious impact, in my view. That's the biggest thing that I think is likely to come about in a relatively narrow Biden win. Where there will be massive information that people that oppose Biden will believe that the election was stolen and was stolen badly, and that disinformation will also be magnified by artificial intelligence, which we've already seen with those fake Biden robocalls in New Hampshire. Just the tip of the iceberg. There were voters that were told with a Biden voice, and they were targeted directly with their real phone numbers and their real names. You are not to go out. We don't want you to go and vote in the primary. Because we want you to vote in the general election, not in the primary. That's artificial intelligence, real cheap. And there are lots of bad actors in the country and outside of the country that would love to foment chaos through those mechanisms.
Yeah, there's no doubt about that. That, in my layman stance, were I putting out my report of risks, AI causing just a massive disinformation campaign in the buildup to the 2024 election, continuing to bifurcate people into different camps where we don't share any facts. That is the thing that freaks me out. And I think that that's going to get better before it gets worse. Sorry, that's going to get worse before it gets better. And yeah, so.
But the reason that we put that in the US risk and not in the AI risk is because it is the vulnerability of the US and the willingness to believe conspiracy theories, the dysfunction and fragmentation of the political system that makes the US election so singularly vulnerable to those sorts of attacks. Those attacks would not work in Japan. They would not work in Germany. Like, people would not go out onto the streets with pitchforks in response to that. In the United States, increasingly different.
Why do you think big tech will become the third superpower, and what are the dangers and opportunities if it does?
Big tech is essentially sovereign over the digital world. The fact that former President Trump was deplatformed from Facebook and from Twitter when he was president, most powerful political figure on the planet, and he's just taken off of those networks, and as a consequence, hundreds of millions of people that would be regularly engaging with him in real time suddenly can't see it. That wasn't a decision that was made by a government. It wasn't a decision made by a judge or by a regulatory authority or even by a multinational organization like the UN. It was made by individuals that own tech companies. The same thing is true in the decision to help Ukraine in the war. In the early days, the U.S. didn't provide much military support. Most of the military capacity and the cyber defenses, the ability to communicate on the ground, was stood up by some tech companies that they're not allies of NATO. They're under no obligation to do that. They've got shareholders, right? But they still decided to do it. I think that whether we're talking about society or the economy or even national security, if it touches the digital space, technology companies basically act with dominion. And that didn't matter much when the internet was first founded, because the importance of the internet for those things was pretty small. But as the importance of the digital world drives a bigger and bigger piece of the global economy, a bigger and bigger piece of civil society, a bigger and bigger piece of national security, and even increasingly defines who we are as people, how we interact with other human beings, what we see, what we decide, what we feel, how we emote. That is an astonishing amount of power. in the hands of these tech companies. And yes, there are some efforts to rein them in, to break them up, to regulate them. But when I look at artificial intelligence in particular, I see these technology companies and their technologies vastly outstripping the capacity of governments to regulate in that space. So does that mean that suddenly you're not going to be citizens of the US? You're going to be citizens of a tech company? No, I'm not going that far. But certainly in terms of who wields the most power over us as human beings, increasingly you would put those companies in that category. And that none of us, even 5 years ago, were thinking about this seriously. And certainly when I was studying as a political scientist, this is my entire career, the geopolitical space is determined by governments, right? Like them or hate them. And some of them are powerful, some of them are weak, some of them are rich, some of them are poor, some are open, some are closed, some are dictatorships, right? Some are democracies, some are functional, some are dysfunctional, but they're in charge. And that increasingly is not true.
As you look at that potential, or not potential, as you look at that growing reality, how does that play out? Does this become the one thing when I look at that I really start getting paranoid about is that AI, especially quantum computing, I'm maybe less familiar with, but sort of lingers in the back of my mind, become one of two things: either weapons used by governments, even if it's not against their own people, though I do, especially with authoritarian governments, I get very paranoid about that. But even if they're just used as warfare against other countries, that sort of quiet, invisible battle freaks me out. And then also, I worry very much about this becoming the new battlefield for a Cold War between the US and China specifically. Do you see us as moving towards that because the tech will make that increasingly easy to fight an invisible war?
I do think, of course, that all of these technologies are both enabling and destructive. And it all depends on the intention of the user. And in some cases, it's someone who's just a tinkerer that makes a mistake or that's playing around and, it explodes. I'm not particularly worried that the robots are going to take over. I'm not particularly worried that we're on the cusp of developing a superhuman intelligence and that we're suddenly irrelevant or we're, held hostage to it. That's, in other words, I mean, I know that you love The Matrix. We talked about that a little bit before the show. This is not my 5-10 year concern. But the idea that this technology is going to proliferate explosively. I mean, vastly beyond anything we ever were concerned about with nuclear weapons. We're 80 years on, it's still just a handful of countries and no corporations, no terrorist groups, no individuals that have access to those nukes. No. AI, with both its productive and destructive capacities, will not just be in the hands of rogue states, but will also be in the hands of people and terrorists and corporations, and they'll have cutting edge access to that. So, I mean, it would be easier to deal with if it was just about the United States and China. And we can talk about the United States and China and how they think about that technology differently and how we're fighting over it and how it has become a technology Cold War. I think that we can say that exists right now, not a Cold War overall, but a technology Cold War. I think that exists. But I think the dangers of AI are far greater than that. It is precisely the fact that non-governments will act as principals in determining the future of the digital world and of society and national security as a consequence. And governments, right now, governments still seem to think that they're going to be the ones that will drive all this regulation. And in the most recent days, the United States is taking just a few baby steps to show that maybe they recognize that that's not the case. But ultimately, either we're going to have to govern in new institutions with technology companies as partners, as signatories, or they're not going to be regulated. And I think that reality is not yet appreciated by citizens. It's not yet appreciated by governments.
Ooh, okay. So tell me more about that. What does the world look like where this technology is proliferating like that and is not regulated?
Well, if it's not regulated at all, that means that everyone has access to it. So let's look at the good side first. Let's be positive and optimistic, because I'm a believer in this technology. I think it does all sorts of incredible things, and I'm not just talking about ChatGPT. I'm talking about the ability to take any proprietary data set and be maximally efficient in extracting value from it. Allowing workers to become AI adjacent in ways that will make them more productive and effective. I look at my own firm, Eurasia Group. We've got about 250 employees. And we did a town hall with them the other day. We do one every quarter. And we were talking about AI. And I said, I don't think there's anyone in any of these offices globally that will be displaced by AI in the next 3 to 5 years. Not one of my knowledge workers. But I said, all of you will be AI adjacent. And if you're not learning how to use AI to dramatically improve your work, whether you are an analyst or whether you're on the business side or you're in finance or you're, on the IT help desk or you're a graphics person, an editor, whatever it is, you will become much less productive than other employees that are doing that. And that will be a problem for you. So we need to get you the tools and you need to learn. So, I think that's true in almost every industry imaginable. It's true in education. It's true in healthcare and for new pharma and vaccines. It's true for new energy and critical infrastructure. And what's so amazing about it, one of the reasons why it's taking us so long to respond to climate change, even now that we all agree that it's happening, we all agree there's 420 parts per million of carbon in the atmosphere. We all agree there's 1.2 degrees centigrade of warming. Like that's no longer in dispute. And yet it's really taking us a long time to get to the point that we can reduce our carbon emissions. And the reason for that is because you need to change the critical infrastructure, right? You need to move from one entire supply chain oriented around carbon to another one oriented around something new, whether that's solar or green hydrogen or you name it, right? When you're talking about AI, you're talking about first and foremost creating efficiencies using your existing critical infrastructure, which means you have no vested corporations that are saying, we don't want that. No, every corporation is saying, how can we invest in that to create greater profitability? Everyone, every oil company is going to use AI, just like every post-fossil fuel company is going to use it. Every bank is going to use it. Every pharmaceutical company, whether they're in mRNA or they're in traditional, vaccines that are developed as we have over decades now. I think that we truly underestimate the impact that will have in unlocking wealth, in unlocking human capital, and it's going to happen fast. It's not decades, as it took with globalization to open markets and get goods and services to move across the world. It's years. In some cases, it's months. And that to me is very, very exciting. So that's the positive side. And frankly, that's what the positive side looks like without regulation too. Because, look, there are trillions of dollars being spent on this rollout, and it's being spent by a lot of people who are hyper smart. They are hyper competitive. They want to get there first before other companies that are in that space. And they don't need any further incentive to ensure that they can roll that out as fast as possible. So you and we can say whatever we want, but it's not, further subsidies are not required, right? Like that is just going to happen. That is going to happen. But what they're not doing, and I'm sure what you want to spend more time on with me, is not the everything's going to be great, or what they call this E-ACK, the sort of exponential accelerationists who just believe that if we just put all this money in it, then we're gonna all become a greater species, and it's just going to happen. But there are going to be a lot of negative externalities, and we know this from globalization. The miracle of your and my lifetimes thus far, before AI, the miracle was we managed to unlock access to the global marketplace for now 8 billion people. Trade and goods and capital and investment and the labor force, the workforce. And that created dislocations It meant that there were a whole bunch of people that were more expensive in the West that lost their jobs as inexpensive labor that was very talented, in China and India gained jobs. But that led to unprecedented growth for 50 years. There were also negative externalities, and those negative externalities played out over many decades. But it's when you take all of this inexpensive coal and oil and gas out of the ground, and you don't realize that you're actually using a limited resource and you're affecting the climate. And so decades later, we all figure out, oh, wait a second, this is a really huge cost on humanity and on all of these other species, many of which are already extinct, and no one's bothered to pay for them. Well, with AI, the negative externalities will happen basically simultaneously with all the positive stuff I just talked about. And just like with climate, none of the people that are driving AI are spending their time or resource figuring out how to deal with those problems. They're spending all their time trying to figure out how to save humanity, how to accelerate this technology. So if we don't talk about those negative externalities, they're just going to happen, and they won't be mitigated. They won't be regulated. And there's a lot of them. And, we can talk through what they are, but I mean, there's, just to put in everyone's head here that kind of like climate change, right? We all wanted globalization. I'm a huge fan of globalization. We all hate climate change. We wish it hadn't happened. You cannot have one without the other. And, the fact that we were so focused on growth and that all of the powerful forces are, let's have more stuff, let's get more GDP, let's extend our lifespans, let's improve our education, let's take people out of abject poverty, all of which are, laudable goals, some more, some less, but things that we all like. But there were consequences that no one wanted, no one dealt with, no one cared as much about, because they're not as directly relevant to us as the shiny apple that's right in front. And that is what is about to happen in exponential fashion with artificial intelligence.
All right, so we've got the shiny object syndrome, myself included. I am deploying AI in my company as fast as I can, but at the same time, I am very worried about how this plays out. You've already touched on job loss. You're not super worried about that in the 3 to 5 year time horizon. I may be a little more worried about that than you, but I gave a similar speech to my company, which is I have literally zero intention to get rid of anybody. But I do have the expectation that all of you are going to be learning how to use AI. And I know that is going to mean I'm going to get efficiencies out of my current workforce, which means I won't be hiring additional people. So while the people I have are safe, it certainly creates instability in people in terms of looking for a new job, the kind of mobility. I don't think people are going to be scaling as quickly as possible. But my real question for you is, given that you have a global perspective, which I've come to late in the game, and for longtime viewers of mine, I will just say the reason I become so obsessed with this, you and I were talking about this before we started rolling, I come at everything from the perspective of the individual. And I think that culture and all these knock-on effects are all downstream of the individual. And if we want a good society, we have to be good individuals, but we have to take the time to say, what is that? Like, what are we aiming towards? What's our North Star? What are we trying to get out of this? So for me, the punchline is human flourishing. I won't spend time in this interview defining what that means. Certainly my listeners have heard me talk about that before. But what do you think about? I assume you will roughly, given the talk that you just gave, will roughly say something similar. We want good things. We want to pull people out of poverty. We want to clean up the environment. There's going to be a lot of things we want to do that I think more or less are about human flourishing. What then is the collision of a new technology like AI becoming so ubiquitous in an unregulated fashion that gives you pause? Is it US-China? Is it a rogue actor making bioweapons? Like, what's the thing that when you look near term, we'll say the 3 to 5 year time horizon, what gives you pause?
So there are a few things. I don't, even though I said I don't think I'm going to fire anyone because of AI, I do worry that the same populist trends that we have experienced in the developed world in particular over the last 20 years can grow faster. If you are a rural, living in a rural area, or you're undereducated, and you're not going to become AI adjacent in the next 5 years, 10 years, in the United States, in Europe, and those people will be left farther behind by the knowledge workers that have that opportunity. And so I'm not saying that they're going to have massive unemployment, but I worry about that.
What do you think about like picking fruit and stuff like that with robots? That make your radar for anything near term? Or?
Again, not so much. So I would say no. Let me tell you why I say no about that. Because when I think about what CEOs do with their workforces, generally they take those productivity gains, they pocket them. They pay out good bonuses to themselves, to their shareholders. Maybe they invest more in growth. But as long as growth is moving, they're not getting rid of a whole bunch of people. They like the people that they have. They want it. They're always thinking the trees are going to grow, sort of to the heavens. And then when they face a sudden contraction, a recession, or even worse, a depression, then suddenly they look at everything around them and say, okay, where can we cut costs? And if a lot of those workers aren't as efficient as they used to be and you get new technologies, suddenly it's not like you're incrementally getting rid of people every year. It's that you've taken a huge swath out of the workplace. So I don't think that that's going to happen suddenly in the next few years, because we're coming out of a mild, narrow slowdown right now, and the next few years should look better. I more think about what happens the next time we're in a major cyclical downturn, and combining that with where we've gotten to with the AI productivity buildup at that point. But I still think that in the interim, you're going to have people that aren't gaining the productivity benefits from AI inside Western economies. And those are the same people that have been hit by the fentanyl crisis. Those are the same people that haven't had good investments in their educational systems. Then around the world, the people, the digital have-nots, the people that aren't even online, so they won't be able to use these new AI tools to improve their knowledge, to have access to better doctors. So they'll be left behind this new turbocharged globalization. And that's a lot of sub-Saharan Africa, first and foremost. So I do think that there are two groups of people that even in the next 5 years that will suffer comparatively and will be angry politically and will create social discontent. So I didn't mean to imply that I didn't care about that or that I thought it was off the screen. It was more that I don't see that as a firm of literally 250 people, like we're tiny. And if you tell me that we're going to have a lot more efficiency, I wouldn't actually hire less. I'd hire more because I want to get to 500 people faster. Like there's just more things that I want to do without taking any outside investment. But that's a tiny, tiny issue compared to the other stuff we're talking about. The things that I'm probably most worried about in the near term, 3 years, let's say, I'd say are three buckets. The first is the disinformation bucket. The fact that inside democracies, increasingly, especially with AI, we as citizens cannot agree on what is true. We can't agree on facts. And that delegitimizes the media. It delegitimizes our leaders and both political parties, or the many political parties that exist in other developed countries. It delegitimizes our judicial system, rule of law. It even delegitimizes our scientists. And you can't really have an effective democracy if there is no longer a fact space. I mean, we're seeing it right now in a tiny way with all of these indictments of Trump. And it doesn't matter what the indictments are. It doesn't matter how many they are. It doesn't matter what he's being indicted for. What matters more to the political outcome is whether or not you favor Trump politically. If you do, then this is politicized. It's a witch hunt. And, Biden should be indicted. And if you don't, then Trump is unfit. And every indictment, doesn't matter what it is, before you even get a result of it, then, he's guilty. And that with AI becomes turbocharged.
I want to get into why that happens. So my first question on that is it's definitely pre-AI, because I think this started breaking down with social media.
Great.
How prior to social media do you think that we were able to come to a consensus on truth?
Well, a couple of reasons. One is that a lot of people got their media from either the same source or from overlapping and adjacent sources. So you had more commonality to talk about politics to the extent that you talked about politics. Second, it was mostly long form. So you would read a newspaper article, you would listen to a radio show, you would watch a television show. You weren't just getting the headline. Because today, if you go on CNN or Fox News on their website and don't look at the headlines, just look at the pieces actually overlap a fair amount. If you look at the headlines, and then if you look at what headlines you're being filtered to, then the news that you're getting is completely different. So I think that's a reason too. And of course, the fact that people are spending so much more time intermediated by algorithms means they're spending less time randomly just meeting their fellow other. And that's even true with the rise of things like dating apps, right? I mean, as opposed to just happening to date someone you were in high school with or in college with, or, you meet at a bar. I mean, if you're meeting that person through a dating app, you're already being sorted in ways that will reduce the randomness of the views that you're exposed to. So in all sorts of tiny ways that add up, that are mostly technologically driven, we become much more sorted, not sorted, though sorted probably too, as a population. And then you put AI into this, and suddenly this is being maxed. So I'll get another example. You'll remember that I think it was David Ogilvy, who the great advertising entrepreneur, who once said that we know that 50% of advertising dollars are useful, 50% are useless. We just don't know what 50%. And of course, now we know how to micro-target. Now we know that when we're spending money, we are spending it to get the eyeballs of the people who are going to be affected by our message. They will be angered by it. They will be titillated by it. They will be engaged by it. They will spend money. They will become more addicted by it. All of those things. And when you do that, you more effectively sort the population, as opposed to throwing a message at the wall, but everybody gets the message. And so it is not the intention to destroy democracy. It is not the intention to rip apart civil society. It is merely an unintended secondary effect of the fact that we've become so good at micro-targeting and sorting that people no longer are together as a nation or as a community. And AI perfects that. AI allows you to take large language models and predict with uncanny capacity what the next thing is. And the next thing for an advertising company is how I can effectively target and reach that person, and not the other person who doesn't care about my message.
Yeah, and keep them engaged. So let me give you my thesis on this. This, I think, is one of the most important things for us to all wrap our heads around. I've thought a lot about why is there a sudden breakdown in truth? And the more I thought about, okay, what is true? How can we go about proving it? The reality is that so much of what we perceive to be true is merely your interpretation of something. So you're going to get a perspective on something built around what I call your frame of reference. So your frame of reference is basically, it's your beliefs and your values that you've cobbled together sort of unknowingly throughout the course of your life. It becomes a lens through which you view everything, but it is a very distorted lens that is not making an effort to give you what is true. It's making an effort to conform to the things you already believe are or ought to be. And so when people confuse that for objective reality, then you have a problem. And so when you introduce AI, when you introduce algorithms, you get massive fragmentation. So now I can serve you just the things that you're interested in. So like if you go to my feed, you're going to niche down into like really weird things around video game creation, which is something that I'm very passionate about, that somebody else isn't going to see. And so you get already that fragmentation. You layer that on top of your perspective, which you're coming with those pre-distortions. Then you layer that on top of the algorithm has an agenda that may not match your agenda. And now all of a sudden you get into these echo chambers that are feeding back to you your same perspective. They're eliminating nuance by giving you, like you were talking about headlines earlier, by giving you like, this is the talking point. And so now everything becomes predictable. If I know you're on the left, I know what you're, on a basket of concepts, I know where you're going to fall. If you're on the right, same basket of concepts, I know where you're going to fall. And so once you get rid of that nuance, now all of a sudden, again, we're not optimized for truth, we're optimized for party line. And because that then feeds into a sense of tribe and I belong and ease of thought, quite frankly, which is one of the things that scares me the most, is like, oh, I don't have to think through that issue myself. I just need to know what my party line is. Cool, got it. And now I go.
Yeah.
And as we get more and more fragmented, now it becomes, okay, I know what my party line is in my very deep fragment here, but I don't know what's true, and I no longer even know how to assess what's true. In fact, I probably think, again, because that distortion reads to me as objective reality. So I think it is true. And so now you have all these people who are like, this is true. Like, there's nothing you could tell me that will make me think any different because I believe this to be true. And so now the question becomes, if I'm right, that truth is perspective and interpretation, and you're soaked in the perspective and interpretation of others, so they reinforce. So it becomes perspective, interpretation, and reinforcement. And so that becomes quote unquote truth. Outside of science, for lack, no, because even science, we run into the same problem. So what do we do?
We run the same problem in science.
Yeah.
Completely.
So in a world where the only way I can think to get on the other side of this quagmire is to go, I want to achieve this thing, and I'm going to state this is my desired outcome. This is the metric by which I will determine whether I have achieved said outcome. And then instead of asking what's true, I just ask, what moved me closer to my goal? Is there any way else around that you see? Or is this just a one-way street to fragmented catastrophe?
No, there are lots of ways out of it. We're just not heading towards any of them. I mean, no, you look at your Twitter feed or your X feed, and you've got the people you're following. And if you're willing to spend the time, you can curate a following feed that has people of all sorts of different backgrounds, inclinations from all over the world. And I do that. But it takes a lot of time and effort, and you need expertise to be able to do that. You have to be able to research and figure out who those people are. You have to know some people in the field. Most people don't do that. But of course, the For You feed is much more titillating. The For You feed is very entertaining. It engages you, it angers you, and it soothes you at the same time. You want more of that. And that, of course, is driving you exactly in the direction you just suggested. Now, a lot of people will say, well, okay, you watch CNN all the time, you should watch some Fox as well. No, that's not the answer. The answer is not watching Fox, because you will just hate watch Fox, because you've already been programmed to realize that everything that the people on the other side saying is false. And so they're all evil. And so all that's doing is validating your existing truth. No, what you really need to, I tell young people this all the time. You really want to understand and get outside what's happening in the United States ecosystem, watch the CBC or Al Jazeera or Deutsche Welle or NHK in Japan. Just watch their English language news once a week for half an hour. It's not very exciting, but it's like a completely external view of what the hell is going on in the United States and the rest of the world. And that forced you, first of all, it's long form. Right? It's not the headlines beating you down. And secondly, it's like you don't actually have your anchor of all of the things that are stirring you up. They're not even playing with that. They're just kind of reporting on the best they can tell what the hell is going on. And then they're occasionally talking to people like that are locals and whatnot, but from every side. That's very valuable. But the thing that worries me about AI, I don't believe that AI is becoming much more like human beings. They're not faking us out by being able to replicate me. I think what's actually happening is technology companies are teaching us more effectively how to engage like computers. I mean, you and I in person, in a conversation, in a relationship, a work relationship, a friend relationship, a sexual relationship, whatever it is, there's nothing a computer can do that can tear us away from that. But if we spend our time increasingly in the digital world, where we are driven by, where all of our inputs are algorithmic, Well, computers can replicate that very easily. And so if they can only make us more like computers, then no, it's not like the Matrix where you want to feed off us in terms of fuel. It's much more that we're very valuable in driving the economy if you give us all of your attention and data. And that is the way that you create, right, a maximal AI economy. It also happens to be completely dehumanizing. Because we all know that human beings are social animals. We know if you stick us in a room or you stick us in a desert island, we're going to like engage with each other, talk to each other, figure out things about each other. Doesn't matter what color we are, what sexual orientation we are. We will figure it out if we're stuck, if we have no choice. But if you take us and you use our most base, most reptilian impulses and you monetize those so that we're the product, oh, no. Then you lose everything we built as human beings, all the governance, all the community, all the social organizations, the churches, the things, the family, the things that matter to us that we're losing, the things that make us rooted and make us sane and make us care and make us love. I mean, flourishing starts right here. It starts at home. It doesn't start online. Flourishing starts. Those are tools that we need to use to create wealth, but you can't flourish if you don't have real relationships. That takes away, it strips away the essence of who we are as people. And yet we are all running headlong away from flourishing.
If you like this conversation, check out this episode to learn more.
Where World War III looks different than World War II is that World War III is being fought through these proxy wars. Third country battles, oftentimes poor or impoverished battles